There is nothing you need to do to be here. You've already arrived. This moment does not require focus or effort or understanding. You don't need to listen closely. You don't need to stay awake. You don't need to follow these words. If your attention drifts, let it drift. If thoughts come and go, that's perfectly fine. The sounds you hear are not instructions. They are not meant to guide you anywhere. They are simply part of the night. You may notice your body beginning to soften on its own. Breathing slows, muscles release. The weight of the day starts to loosen without being pushed away. The stories that follow are not meant to be remembered. They can pass through you like distant lights seen through fog. At some point, the words may fade. That is not a mistake. That is rest beginning. So allow yourself to do less than nothing. Let the night hold you now. This is the long night, and you are safe to fall asleep here. 5. As the night begins to slow and the outside world grows quieter, there is nothing you need to understand or prepare for. Somewhere without effort or urgency, a journey is already unfolding, one that moves at its own pace, carrying only what it believes it must. The traveler had been moving for a long time, not in a hurried way and not with any sense of urgency, but continuously as though each day simply carried him into the next. The road itself was calm, the air steady, and nothing around him suggested difficulty or danger. And yet there was no real sense of rest. Even when he stopped walking, the movement did not fully stop. It continued quietly inside him. The pack on his back was familiar, so familiar that he no longer questioned it. It had always been there, first lightly and then with more added along the way. Small things at first, useful things, things that might be needed later. He could not remember a moment when he decided to carry so much. There was no clear choice, only a series of quiet assumptions. It felt safer to be prepared. Better to have more than less. When he paused by the side of the path, he did not remove the pack. He leaned forward slightly, resting just enough to continue again soon. Even in stillness, his body remained angled toward motion. The muscles in his shoulders stayed engaged, and the weight never truly left him. Around him, the world did not ask for this effort. The path lay open, the ground held firm, and the distance ahead was patient. But the traveler could not feel that patience. Inside, there was a constant sense of needing to continue, as though stopping completely might cause something important to be lost. His breathing remained steady but shallow. Each inhale prepared for the next step. Each exhale carried a quiet tension. There was no sharp discomfort, yet no pain that demanded attention, only a subtle heaviness that had begun to feel normal. So normal, in fact, that he no longer recognized it as weight at all. To him, this was simply what traveling felt like. Movement without arrival, rest without release. And so after only a brief pause, he adjusted the pack on his shoulders and continued forward, unaware that the journey itself was not what was tiring him. For a long time, the traveler believed the weight he carried was necessary. Each item in the pack had a reason, or at least a memory of a reason. Some had been added because they were useful once, others because they might be useful again. None of them felt excessive when they were first picked up. There was a quiet logic to it. Carrying more meant being prepared. Prepared meant safe. And safety, even imagined safety, was comforting. so he rarely questioned what he carried. The pack became part of how he understood the journey, as though traveling itself required a certain amount of burden. From time to time, he would adjust the straps, shifting the weight slightly from one shoulder to the other. The movement offered brief relief enough to convince him that the load was manageable. He told himself that the strain was simply part of the path, something everyone accepted without complaint. When he met others along the way, he noticed that some carried less. A few even walked freely with nothing visible on their backs. He wondered how they managed. Perhaps they knew something he did not. Or perhaps they were careless. He never stayed with the thought long enough to decide. Letting go felt irresponsible. If he removed something and later needed it, there would be no way to retrieve it. The risk, however small, seemed unnecessary. Better to carry it all and avoid regret. The future, after all, was uncertain, and the weight offered a sense of control over what had not yet happened. And so the pack remained full. Not because every item was needed, but because each one represented a possibility, a precaution, a way of staying ahead of what might come. Over time, this logic settled so deeply that it no longer felt like a choice. The weight was no longer something he carried. It was something he relied on. Without it, the journey felt incomplete, almost unsafe. What he did not notice was how quietly the burden had changed his pace. His steps had grown shorter, his pauses more frequent. Not enough to stop him, but enough to slow him in ways he had never planned. Still, he continued forward, convinced that what he carried was essential, unaware that necessity had become a habit and habit had become weight. The strain did not arrive suddenly. It never announced itself. It appeared in small, almost forgettable ways, the kind that were easy to overlook when the road continued to stretch forward. The traveler noticed that his steps had become more measured. He no longer moved with the same ease he once had, though he could not say exactly when that change began. His pace slowed slightly, not enough to draw concern, just enough to feel different. The path had not changed, but his body responded as though it had. At rest, he found himself standing rather than sitting. Sitting meant removing the pack, and removing the pack felt like admitting something was wrong. Standing, he could pretend nothing had shifted. He leaned on one leg, then the other, adjusting his balance in small ways that brought temporary comfort. His shoulders grew tense without his noticing. The muscles remained engaged even when there was no need to move. When he tried to relax them, they resisted as though they had forgotten how to soften completely. The weight had taught them to stay alert. Breathing changed too, though quietly. He still breathed steadily, but the depth was gone. Each breath served the movement ahead rather than the moment he was in. Rest became something brief and functional, not something to settle into. At times, he would stop longer than intended, staring at the ground or the horizon without really seeing either. These pauses were not planned. They happened when his body asked for a moment his mind had not agreed to give. He told himself this was normal. Everyone grew tired on long journeys. Fatigue did not mean the path was wrong, only that it was long. And long paths, he believed, were meant to be endured. So he adjusted the pack again, tightened the straps, and continued. The relief was short-lived, but it was enough to reassure him. Enough to believe that the weight was still manageable, still justified. What he did not realize was that these small signs were not warnings meant to stop him. They were invitations to notice, invitations he continued to pass by, certain that slowing down meant falling behind. And so the strain remained subtle, woven gently into the rhythm of his steps, quietly shaping the journey without ever demanding to be seen. The strain did not arrive all at once. It came quietly in ways so small they were easy to ignore. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt wrong enough to stop. The traveler noticed that his steps had grown more deliberate. He still moved forward without hesitation. But the ease he once carried was no longer there. The rhythm of walking had changed subtly, as though his body was compensating for something his mind had not yet acknowledged. When he paused, he rarely sat down. Sitting meant setting the pack aside, even briefly, and that felt unnecessary. Standing allowed him to rest without admitting fatigue. He shifted his weight from one leg to the other, finding comfort in movement rather than stillness. His shoulders remained tight long after the road flattened. Muscles stayed engaged even when there was no incline to justify them. When he tried to relax, the tension returned almost immediately, as though his body had learned to remain prepared at all times. Breathing changed as well, though he did not notice it at first. It stayed steady but shallow. Each breath seemed to serve the next step instead of the moment he was in. Rest became functional, something meant to restore movement rather than offer ease. There were moments when he stopped longer than he intended to. He would find himself standing quietly, looking ahead without really seeing the path. These pauses were unplanned. They arrived when his body asked for something his mind was not ready to give. He told himself this was simply how long journeys worked. Fatigue was expected. Discomfort was normal. Carrying weight meant endurance, and endurance meant progress. Slowing down, in his view, was part of the cost, not a signal. So he adjusted the straps again, tightened them carefully, and continued. The brief relief that followed was enough to reassure him that everything was still under control. What he did not realize was that these small changes were not signs of failure. They were quiet signals asking to be noticed rather than fixed, signals he continued to pass by, convinced that stopping to listen would only delay him. And so the strain remained gentle and unspoken, woven into each step, shaping the journey without ever demanding his attention. The pause did not come as a decision. It arrived on its own, slipping quietly into the journey at a moment when the traveler expected to keep moving. He had intended only to slow his pace, nothing more. But as he stepped off the path and stood beneath the open sky, his body refused to follow the familiar instruction to continue. The pack felt heavier than it had a moment before, not suddenly but undeniably. His feet remained still. For the first time, he allowed himself to stop without preparing to move again, right away. The road stretched ahead as it always had, patient and unchanged. But something in him no longer responded to its invitation. He stood there longer than he meant to, long enough for the quiet around him to become noticeable. The wind moved gently. The ground felt solid beneath his feet. Nothing urged him forward. Nothing asked him to stay. Without thinking, he loosened the straps of the pack slightly, just enough to feel the shift. The weight did not disappear, but it settled differently, closer to the ground, closer to where he stood. As the tension eased even a little, He noticed how tired his shoulders were. Not sharply tired, but deeply so. As though they had been holding more than just the pack. His breathing slowed, without effort finding a rhythm that did not prepare for the next step. Time passed, though it was difficult to say how much. There was no urgency to measure it. For the first time in a while, the traveler was not counting distance or progress. He was simply standing where he was. The thought crossed his mind that this pause had not been part of the plan. There had been no intention to stop here, no reason marked on the map, and yet, the pause felt necessary in a way plans rarely accounted for. He did not remove the pack completely, not yet. But something had shifted. The journey no longer felt like something that had to be pushed through. It felt like something that could be met differently. When he finally took a step forward again, it was slower, more deliberate. Not because he was forcing caution, but because the pause had changed the rhythm. The road was the same, the direction unchanged, but the movement now carried a hint of awareness that had not been there before. The pause had not stopped the journey. It had simply interrupted the habit of never stopping at all. As the traveler continued, something subtle remained with him. The pause had ended, but its effect had not. The weight on his back felt different, not lighter but more visible, as though it had finally come into focus. He began to notice the pack itself, not just as a familiar presence, but as something distinct from him. Before it had blended into the movement of walking inseparable from the journey. Now there was a small but important distance, enough to observe without judgment. Each item inside had once made sense. Some had been useful, others comforting others, carried simply because they had always been there. None of them were wrong. None of them needed to be condemned or discarded in a moment of resolve. But he saw perhaps for the first time that not everything needed to be carried all the time. This recognition did not arrive as a dramatic decision. There was no sudden urge to empty the pack or abandon the road. It was quieter than that. More like a soft question that did not require an immediate answer. What would it feel like to carry less? The question lingered without pressure. It did not demand action. It simply existed alongside the rhythm of his steps. As he walked, he loosened his grip on the idea that every item was essential. The future, he realized, did not require quite as much preparation as he had assumed. Some things could be trusted to meet him when they were needed. The pack remained on his back, but it no longer defined the journey. It was part of the experience, not the reason for it. The weight was still there, but it had lost its authority. The traveler moved forward with the same destination, the same path, and the same pace. Nothing outwardly had changed. And yet the journey felt different. Not easier, just clearer. And in that clarity there was the beginning of a choice. Not a choice he needed to make now, but one that could wait patiently, like the road itself. When one form of effort becomes visible, another often reveals itself quietly. Not on the road, but in still places. In rooms where nothing seems to happen and yet attention learns to linger. The keeper did not ask to be chosen. The task came to him quietly, without ceremony or explanation. One day he was simply told that the lamp was now his responsibility. It was not an elaborate lamp. There was nothing ornate about it. Its value was not obvious at first glance, and no one spoke of what might happen if it were neglected. Only that It should be kept lit, only that it should not be forgotten. At first, the responsibility felt simple, almost grounding. The keeper placed the lamp where he could see it easily, and went on with his day. Checking it from time to time felt natural, even comforting, like confirming that something familiar was still where it belonged. The flame burned steadily. It did not flicker or demand attention. As long as it was there, everything seemed in order. The keeper took pride in this quiet duty. It gave shape to his time. It gave him a reason to pause, to return, to make sure all was well. The act of watching over the lamp felt meaningful, as though he were protecting something fragile, even if he could not explain why. As days passed, the lamp became part of his awareness. Not intrusive, not urgent, but present. Whenever he moved through the room, his eyes would find it without effort. Whenever he left, a small part of him remained behind, keeping watch. There was no fear yet, no tension, only attentiveness. If the flame burned evenly, he felt at ease. If it seemed lower than before, he adjusted it carefully. Each action was small, but each one reinforced the idea that the lamp required him. He did not consider what might happen if he looked away for a while. The thought never arose. Responsibility, once accepted, tends to settle quietly into routine. And so the keeper continued, attentive but unburdened, unaware that the simple act of being entrusted had begun to shape not just what he watched, but how he rested. At first, caring for the lamp required very little effort. The keeper checked it when he passed by, adjusted it when necessary, and then moved on. It fit naturally into the rhythm of his day, like any other simple task. Over time, however, the attention began to sharpen. The keeper found himself glancing toward the lamp more often than before. Not because something was wrong, but because it felt important to be certain. The flame still burned, steadily unchanged, yet the act of checking became slightly more deliberate. Care slowly took on a different quality. He noticed that he no longer passed the lamp without looking. Even when engaged in other tasks, part of his awareness remained fixed on it. A quiet habit formed, one that did not interrupt his day but followed it closely. When the room grew dim, his eyes went to the flame. When he prepared to leave, he paused just briefly to confirm that it remained as it should be. These moments were small, barely noticeable, but they added up. The lamp had not asked for this level of attention. It did not flicker or threaten to go out. And yet the keeper felt responsible for anticipating any possibility, however unlikely. Care had become vigilance. The shift was subtle enough that he did not question it. Vigilance felt like dedication, like doing the task well. The more attentive he became, the more important the responsibility seemed. And with that importance came a quiet tension. He began to feel uneasy when the lamp was out of sight. If he was called away, a part of his mind remained behind, tracking the flame in his absence. Nothing had ever gone wrong, but the thought of not watching felt incomplete, as though something essential were being neglected. Even rest changed slightly. When he sat down, his body relaxed, but his attention did not. The lamp remained present in his awareness, like a thought that never fully finished. Still, he told himself this was normal, that caring meant staying alert, that responsibility required constancy. The vigilance did not feel heavy yet, it felt justified, and so the keeper continued believing that his growing watchfulness was a sign of commitment, unaware that care once tightened can quietly become a burden long before it feels like one. Rest used to arrive without effort. When the keeper finished his work for the day, he would sit near the window, letting the quiet of evening settle naturally around him. The room would dim, sounds would soften, and the lamp would glow gently in the background, steady and unchanged. At first, nothing seemed different, but slowly, rest began to thin. Even as his body settled, a small alertness remained. It did not announce itself loudly. It appeared as a faint pull of attention, a subtle checking that happened without intention. His eyes drifted toward the lamp, then away, then back again. The flame was fine. It always was. Still, the moment of rest no longer felt complete without that glance. Silence felt slightly unfinished, unless he confirmed once more that nothing had shifted. He tried sitting farther from the lamp. The distance helped briefly, but the awareness followed him. Not as worry exactly, but as readiness. As if something might require him at any moment. The keeper noticed that his breathing, once slow and unmeasured, had begun to carry a rhythm shaped by listening. He listened for changes that never came, for signals that did not exist. The lamp remained silent. Even when his eyes closed, the image of the flame stayed with him. Not sharply, but enough to keep part of his mind awake. Thoughts did not race, they hovered, lingering just above rest, never fully dissolving. He told himself this was simply responsibility, that a good keeper remained available even in stillness. And yet something had shifted. Rest was no longer a place he entered completely. It had become a condition he approached, but did not quite arrive at. The room itself had not changed. The lamp burned as it always had. The night unfolded with the same quiet patience. Only the keeper had changed, not in any obvious way, not enough to cause concern. Just enough that rest now carried a faint edge like water that no longer felt entirely warm. He did not name this feeling. He did not resist it. He simply adapted, unaware that true rest requires permission to look away. And so the night passed, calm on the surface, while attention remained gently, persistently engaged. At some point, without a clear beginning, watching became the default. The keeper no longer remembered when trust had quietly stepped aside. There had been no incident, no failure of the lamp, no reason to doubt its steady presence. And yet the sense that it could simply be left alone had faded. Trust, he realized, had once meant knowing the lamp would burn whether or not he was there to witness it. Now presence felt necessary, as if the flame depended on his attention to remain as it was. He stayed closer than before, not out of fear, but out of habit. The space between him and the lamp narrowed until it felt unnatural to widen it again. When he left the room, he hesitated, not long enough for anyone to notice, but long enough for the moment to register within him. A pause, a glance back, a reassurance he no longer questioned. The lamp did not respond. It did not brighten or dim in recognition of his vigilance. It remained unchanged, indifferent to being watched or ignored. Still the keeper watched. He told himself this was care refined into responsibility. That trust, while comforting, was incomplete without oversight. And yet something essential had quietly shifted. Trust had once allowed him to rest elsewhere, to turn his attention outward, to let the lamp exist without being held in mind. Now watching had replaced that ease. His thoughts no longer wandered freely. They looped gently, returning again and again to the same point. Not urgently, not anxiously, just repeatedly. The act of watching felt calm on the surface, but beneath it lived a subtle tension. A readiness that never fully relaxed. A belief that if he looked away, something might be missed. Nothing ever was. The lamp continued its steady glow through every hour, asking nothing, requiring nothing. And still the keeper remained near. Trust, once spacious, had narrowed into supervision. And supervision, though quiet, demanded presence. The room felt smaller now, not because the walls had moved, but because attention no longer traveled beyond them. The keeper did not resist this change. He did not name it as loss. It simply became the way things were. And so the night settled in again, familiar and calm, while watching quietly took the place of trust. The weight did not arrive suddenly. It settled the way dust does, layer by layer, unnoticed, until something small disturbed it. For the keeper, that disturbance came during an ordinary moment so unremarkable that it might have passed unseen. He reached for a cup of water. The lamp was behind him, still burning, still steady. And yet as he lifted the cup, a tightening moved through his chest. Not fear, not urgency, just the faint discomfort of attention pulled away. He turned his head almost without thinking and checked the flame. It was exactly as it had been. The keeper paused, cup still in his hand, and in that pause something became clear. Watching was no longer neutral. It carried effort now, a quiet demand. He noticed how often his body moved before his thoughts, how glances happened without permission, how even simple actions were accompanied by an invisible thread pulling his awareness back. The lamp had not changed, but the act of watching had grown dense. What once felt like care now required energy, not enough to exhaust him, but enough to be felt. Enough to register as weight. When he sat, his shoulders did not fully release. When he stood, part of him remained anchored. Attention had become something he carried, not something that moved freely. He tried briefly to look away on purpose, just to see what would happen. Nothing did. The flame remained steady, the room unchanged. The world did not respond to his small experiment, and yet the tension remained, not because of the lamp, but because of the holding. In that moment, the keeper understood something without words. Watching had quietly replaced trust, and now it demanded payment. The payment was not dramatic. It was subtle, continuous, a low-level strain that followed him from moment to moment. He did not judge himself for this realization. He did not decide to change anything. He simply noticed, and noticing brought a strange kind of relief. The weight had been unnamed until now. Seen, it felt slightly less oppressive. Still present, but no longer confusing. The keeper sat again, the lamp behind him, and for the first time in many nights, he did not immediately turn to look. The flame continued, and in that small space between attention and action, the first hint of letting go appeared. The change did not come as a decision. There was no moment when the keeper resolved to stop watching. No inner speech, no promise to himself. What happened was quieter than that. One evening, as the room settled into its familiar stillness, he noticed his body resting more fully against the chair. His breathing slowed without effort. The lamp remained where it always had been, its glow unchanged, and for a moment his attention did not reach for it. The absence of watching felt unfamiliar, like stepping into open space after standing too close to a wall. There was no rush of relief, no fear either, just a gentle widening. He waited for the old reflex to return. It did not. The lamp burned on its own. The keeper realized then that trust had never truly left. It had only been crowded out by habit, by the belief that attention was required for things to remain as they were. Nothing in the room asked for supervision. Nothing needed to be managed. The flame continued steady and indifferent to whether it was being observed. He allowed this understanding to settle without grasping it, without turning it into another task. Letting go, he sensed, was not something to perform. It was something that happened when effort quietly stepped aside. The space in the room felt larger now, not because anything had moved, but because attention no longer circled the same point. It drifted naturally, resting where it wished, returning when needed, leaving when it did not. The keeper remained present, but not fixed. For the first time in a long while, rest arrived without interruption. It did not announce itself. It simply filled the space that watching had once occupied. The lamp burned through the night as it always had, and the keeper slept. Not deeply, not dramatically. Just enough. Enough to feel the difference between holding and allowing. By morning, nothing had changed. The lamp still stood. The flame still glowed. Only the effort had gone, and in its absence, something simpler remained. Not all burdens are carried through distance. Some are held in time itself, suspended between now and later, waiting without ever arriving. The village did not fall silent all at once. At first there were still sounds moving gently through it. Doors closing in the evening, footsteps fading along familiar paths. The distant murmur of voices carried briefly by the air before dissolving. Nothing unusual. The village had always known how to quiet itself when the day was done. Lamps dimmed, fires softened, people rested where they were without needing to announce it. Over time, however, the spaces between sounds grew wider. Not because anyone chose silence, but because fewer things needed to be said. Fewer movements needed to happen. The village continued to exist, but with less insistence. A window remained open without being adjusted. A path went unused, not abandoned, simply untraveled. The night arrived, and no one hurried to meet it. Even the animals seemed to sense the shift. Their movements slowed. Their calls shortened, then stopped. Breath replaced motion. Stillness replaced intention. Silence was not enforced. It was allowed. Those who remained awake did not remark on it. There was no moment of recognition. No one thought the village is quiet now. The quiet arrived without being named. Time loosened. Moments passed without being counted. One breath followed another. The distinction between listening and not listening softened until it no longer mattered. The village did not disappear. It remained exactly where it was. Houses stood. Roads rested beneath the night sky. Everything necessary remained intact. Only effort withdrew. Thoughts, once moving gently from one thing to another, began to settle. Not stopping, but spacing themselves farther apart, like clouds thinning until the sky no longer noticed them. Nothing needed to be remembered. Nothing needed to be held. The village drifted not away but inward, toward a place where sound had no urgency and silence required no explanation. And in that drifting, rest arrived. Not suddenly, not deeply, just enough. Enough for the village to continue without attention. Enough for awareness to remain without activity. The river did not hurry. It moved with a steadiness that did not require intention, carrying whatever entered its path without weighing the decision. Leaves drifted along its surface. Stones rested beneath it. Reflections appeared and vanished without comment. Nothing in the river struggled to move forward. At the banks, the world felt still. Trees stood without leaning. Grass bent only when the water touched it. The river accepted everything exactly as it arrived, neither holding nor releasing, simply continuing. There was no point where the river decided to flow. It had never begun, and it did not anticipate an end. Movement existed without effort, guided by a direction so natural it did not feel like direction at all. A branch entered the water and floated briefly, then turned slowly, adjusting without resistance. The river did not correct its course. It did not guide. It allowed. Beneath the surface, currents shifted quietly, unseen. What moved there did not announce itself. It did not ask to be observed. It continued whether attention followed it or not. The sound of water was soft, nearly absent. Not silence, but something close enough that the difference did not matter. Listening became optional. The river carried weight without feeling heavy. It held depth without appearing deep. Even the idea of effort seemed out of place here, as if it belonged to another landscape entirely. Time lost its shape. Moments did not connect to one another. They arrived whole, then passed intact. The river did not keep them. Awareness rested alongside the movement, not following, not directing. Simply present the way water is present to itself. Nothing needed to be managed. Nothing needed to be named. The river flowed, and in that movement there was rest. Not because anything stopped, but because nothing resisted. The light did not come from anywhere. It was already there, resting in the space without announcing itself. No source could be identified. No edge defined where it began or ended. It did not brighten the room so much as reveal that the room had never been dark. Thoughts moved through it at first, passing like faint shadows. They appeared thinned and dissolved, leaving no trace behind. Nothing followed them. Nothing waited for their return. The mind did not try to understand what remained. Understanding felt unnecessary here. As thinking slowed, the light did not change. It did not increase or fade. It simply continued steady and quiet, unaffected by the absence of mental movement. There was no effort required to stay with it. Attention did not need to be held. It rested naturally the way eyes rest when they are no longer searching. Breath moved without instruction. The body remained present without comment. Sensation softened until it no longer separated itself into parts. The light held all of it without preference. Time loosened further. There was no sense of before or after. Only this presence complete in itself, continuing without needing confirmation. Nothing asked to be named. Nothing needed to be remembered. The mind, having released its need to follow each thought, did not disappear. It simply became quiet enough to blend into what was already there. The light remained, not as an object, not as an experience, but as something closer than either. It did not require awareness to be focused on it. It did not withdraw when attention drifted. It stayed patient and unchanged. Even the idea of rest softened here. There was no transition into sleep, no threshold to cross, only a gentle continuity where wakefulness and rest no longer felt separate. The light remained when thinking stopped, and nothing needed to follow. The dream did not announce itself as a dream. It arrived quietly without crossing any clear boundary. There was no moment when waking ended and something else began. Images appeared without asking to be understood, drifting in the same way thoughts once had, but softer, less defined. A place suggested itself, then loosened. Shapes formed briefly and released. Nothing stayed long enough to require attention. The dream did not move toward a point. It wandered without direction, without purpose, and without consequence. Scenes did not connect. They simply passed through, complete in their passing. There was no effort to remember, no attempt to interpret. Meaning did not gather around what appeared. It felt unnecessary, even distant, like a language no longer being spoken. The mind did not follow the dream. It rested nearby, unconcerned with sequence or sense. Awareness floated, not attached to what arose, not resisting what faded. Time had little presence here. Moments did not stack. They dissolved as soon as they formed, leaving no trace of order behind them. The body remained still, barely felt. Breath continued somewhere in the background, quiet and steady, requiring nothing. The dream did not belong to anyone. It did not ask to be claimed or remembered. It did not insist on being real or unreal. It was simply happening. Images softened, further thinning until they became impressions rather than scenes. Even those impressions faded, leaving only a gentle movement with no content. Nothing needed to be held. Nothing needed to be released. The dream did not resolve. It did not end. It simply became less distinct, blending into the same quiet presence that had been there all along. And in that blending, the need for meaning dissolved completely. What remained was not clarity and not confusion, only rest continuing without explanation. Sleep did not arrive as an event. There was no moment to point to, no shift dramatic enough to be recognized. It came the way darkness comes at the edge of evening, so gradually that noticing it meant it had already been there for a while. Awareness softened further, not fading but loosening its grip. Attention no longer searched for anything to rest on. It settled wherever it happened to be, then drifted again without effort. Breath continued steady and unremarkable. The body felt distant, as though it were resting somewhere nearby rather than being inhabited. Sensation did not disappear. It simply lost its edges. Thoughts no longer formed clearly. What remained were fragments without shape, impressions without direction. They rose briefly and dissolved before becoming anything at all. Sleep moved in quietly without permission. There was no resistance to meet it, no attempt to stay awake, no intention to fall asleep. The space where intention once lived had already emptied. Time had little meaning here. There was no sense of waiting, no awareness of passing moments. Everything unfolded in a single continuous softness. The world outside did not withdraw. It simply stopped asking to be noticed. Sounds blended into one another. Silence and noise lost their distinction. The self grew faint, not gone, not erased, just unimportant. Sleep did not take anything away. It added nothing either. It settled like a blanket that had already been there unnoticed until warmth was felt. There was no transition to mark, no boundary crossed. One state flowed into the next so gently that they could no longer be separated. Sleep arrived before being noticed, and noticing never returned. The night did not continue as a story. There was nothing left to unfold, nothing waiting to be revealed. Words had already done all they could, and now they loosened their hold, thinning into the same quiet they once described. The night simply remained. There was no center to it, no edge, no beginning that needed remembering. It held everything evenly without asking to be noticed, without offering anything in return. Breath moved somewhere gently without ownership. The body rested where it was no longer checked or adjusted. Sensation drifted in and out, indistinct, like distant weather passing without arrival. Awareness no longer followed anything. It did not settle. It did not wander. It rested in a way that did not require direction. Nothing needed to make sense. Thought, if it appeared at all, was faint and incomplete. It did not form questions. It did not look for answers. It dissolved before becoming anything recognizable. The night continued without sequence, without meaning, without memory. There was no need to stay with it, no need to leave, no need to arrive anywhere else. Sound softened further, losing its shape. Silence did not replace it. The two simply blended, indistinguishable. Time was no longer present as movement. It did not pass, it did not pause, it no longer mattered. The night did not close, it did not open, it did not end, it continued. And in that continuation, nothing was required. No attention, no understanding, no story. Only the quiet persistence of rest holding everything without effort. Sometimes the things we protect feel fragile only because we have been watching them for too long. In places where no threat has ever arrived, attention can quietly build walls of its own, mistaking vigilance for safety. The house was built with care, not quickly and not carelessly. Each wall was measured, each beam placed with intention. The builder did not rush, believing that what was made slowly would last longer. The house stood on solid ground, quiet, and contained offering shelter without drawing attention to itself. At first, protection felt like wisdom. The door was sturdy. The window sat slightly higher than necessary. The walls were thick enough to keep the inside separate from whatever might pass outside. None of this came from fear. It came from foresight, from the belief that it was better to prepare than to regret. As time passed, more was added. A second lock appeared, then a third. The windows were reinforced, corners were strengthened. Each addition made sense on its own. Each one answered a question that had never been asked aloud. What if something happens? The house remained quiet. No threats arrived. The path leading to the door stayed empty. The nights passed without interruption. Still, the work continued. Protection became refinement. Refinement became habit, and habit settled into routine without resistance. The builder no longer noticed when another layer was added. It felt natural, even responsible, to make the house stronger than it needed to be. Inside, the space grew smaller, not dramatically, just enough to be felt. Light entered more narrowly, sound softened, air moved less freely. The house did its job well. It kept everything out, and in doing so, it began to keep things in as well. The builder did not see this as a problem. Safety, after all, required boundaries. Boundaries required structure, and structure once built rarely asked to be questioned. So the house stood firm, solid, and prepared, shaped by careful attention. From the outside, it looked secure. From the inside, it felt contained. Nothing had gone wrong. Nothing had needed defending. And yet protection continued to grow. quietly shaping the space it was meant to preserve. Once the house felt complete, attention shifted. The builder no longer focused on adding or strengthening. Instead, watching began. Not urgently, not with suspicion, just a steady awareness of where the edges were and what lay beyond them. Each day the boundaries were checked. The door was tested not because it had failed before, but because it could be tested. Windows were examined in passing. Corners were noted. The act of noticing felt harmless, even sensible. The world outside remained unchanged. Paths stayed empty. Sounds arrived and left without interruption. Nothing pressed against the walls. Still watching continued. Over time, the builder grew familiar with every line and limit of the house. Each boundary became known not just as structure but as reassurance. Knowing where things ended created a sense of control over what might approach. Watching felt like care. If something ever came, it would be seen early. If something ever shifted, it would be noticed. The house would not be caught unprepared, but nothing ever came. The nights passed quietly. The days unfolded without disturbance, and yet attention did not relax. It lingered near the edges, returning again and again to the same points as though repetition itself provided safety. The builder found it harder to settle inside. Even when seated, even when resting, part of the mind remained near the walls. Not alert exactly, just present. Boundaries that had once been background became foreground. The inside of the house felt secure, but also contained by the constant awareness of where it ended. Space was no longer simply space. It was measured, defined, watched. The builder did not question this shift. Vigilance felt responsible. Letting attention drift away from the edges felt careless even if there was no reason for concern. So watching became part of living. Not because danger existed, but because boundaries had been drawn so clearly that they invited attention to remain with them. The house stood firm, unchanged and undisturbed, and the watching, having found nothing to respond to, quietly began to watch itself. Days passed and then more days, each one leaving the house exactly as it had been found. The door remained closed, the locks untouched, the windows clear. Nothing approached and nothing tested the boundaries that had been so carefully watched. No one ever came. At first, this absence felt reassuring. It confirmed what the builder had believed all along, that preparation had worked. That vigilance had kept the house safe. The quiet was taken as proof. But as time continued without interruption, the meaning of that quiet began to shift. The builder noticed that watching no longer brought comfort. Each check returned the same result, offering nothing new to confirm or correct. The door was still strong, the walls unchanged, the world outside uninterested. There were moments when the builder paused mid-check, realizing that the motion had become automatic. A hand reached for a lock that had never been turned. Eyes traced a window that had never been touched. Nothing had required defending. The path leading to the house showed no signs of use. Leaves settled undisturbed. Footprints never appeared. Even the wind passed by without lingering. The builder began to wonder, not with urgency, but with a quiet curiosity, what exactly had been expected. There was no memory of a threat, only the assumption that one might exist. Watching continued, but it had lost its purpose. The realization arrived gently, not as doubt and not as regret, simply as an observation that had been waiting to be noticed. If nothing had ever come, then what had all this attention been? For the question did not demand an answer. It did not push toward action. It rested in the space created by repetition that no longer reassured. The house remained exactly as it had always been, secure, silent, and untouched. And in that constancy, something loosened. Not the walls, not the locks, but the certainty that they had been necessary. The builder stood inside the house, surrounded by protection that had never been tested, and for the first time allowed the possibility that safety had existed long before it was built. Living inside the house became familiar. The builder moved through the rooms with ease, knowing every corner, every angle, every place where the walls held firm. Nothing surprised him. Everything was accounted for. The house felt predictable, and in that predictability, safe. But the safety came with a subtle change. Light entered differently now, not less exactly, but more carefully. It passed through smaller openings, tracing narrower paths across the floor. The air moved slowly as though it had learned to stay within certain limits. Sound softened, not because the world outside was quieter, but because the walls held it gently, keeping it from traveling too far. The builder noticed these things without concern. Protection, after all, was meant to create separation. The inside was not supposed to feel like the outside. Still, something about the space felt contained in a way that went beyond shelter. Time inside the house seemed to move differently. Days passed without clear distinction. Mornings blended into afternoons. Evenings arrived quietly without prompting the sense of closure they once had. There was no danger here, no threat pressing in. And yet the builder found himself less inclined to linger near the windows. Looking outward felt unnecessary. Everything needed was already inside. The walls did their work well. They kept the outside out, and slowly they kept the inside in. The builder did not feel trapped. There were doors. There were locks that could be opened. Nothing prevented him from leaving. And yet the idea of stepping beyond the boundaries felt distant, abstract, as though it belonged to another version of life. Living inside defenses had become normal, comfortable even. The house no longer felt like protection against something specific. It felt like the default shape of existence. The builder adjusted to its limits without noticing the adjustment happening. Nothing had gone wrong. Nothing felt unsafe. But something subtle had been exchanged. The openness of the outside world had been replaced with certainty. And certainty, while steady, asked for less movement, less curiosity, less space. The builder remained inside the house, held by walls that had never been tested, living within defenses that no longer pointed outward but inward. The shift did not announce itself. There was no decision to change the house, no plan to open the walls or step beyond them. What changed was quieter, almost unnoticeable at first. Attention, which had spent so long resting on boundaries, began to drift inward on its own. The builder found himself sitting without watching, not deliberately, simply forgetting for a moment to check the door or trace the window with his eyes. The room remained still. The house stood as it always had. Nothing reacted to the absence of vigilance. Inside the walls, sensations became clearer. The weight of the body against the chair, the rhythm of breath, the subtle presence of space that had always been there, waiting beneath the layers of protection. The house no longer felt like something that needed to be monitored. It felt like a container that could be inhabited without effort. The boundaries, once so prominent, faded into the background, holding quietly, without asking for attention. The builder noticed how much energy had been spent on watching, not with regret, but with a gentle understanding. Protection had been a way of relating to the world. Now that way was loosening. There was no urge to dismantle anything, no need to prove that the walls were unnecessary. The realization stood on its own, calm and complete. Safety, it seemed, did not depend on constant defense. It existed in the simple act of being present where one already was. The house remained, the walls remained, but they no longer defined the experience inside them. Attention rested more deeply now, no longer circling the edges. The sense of inside and outside softened, giving way to something quieter, something less concerned with form. And without trying to move anywhere else, the builder found himself closer to rest than he had been at any point within the carefully defended walls. The house did not need defending, and neither did what was happening within it. When attention no longer needs to guard its edges, it often discovers a quieter form of holding. Not protection, but responsibility that arrives gently, without urgency or explanation. The request came without ceremony. There was no explanation of importance, no warning of consequence. One day the task was simply placed in his care, not handed over dramatically, but mentioned in passing as though it were something that had always belonged there. He was asked to watch over something. Not constantly, not closely, just enough. At first, the responsibility felt uncomplicated, almost weightless. It did not interrupt his day or ask him to change his rhythm. He acknowledged it, accepted it, and continued on as before. What he was watching over did not move. It did not demand attention. It existed quietly, unchanged from one moment to the next. There was no sign that it needed him, and no sign that it did not. That uncertainty felt acceptable. He checked on it occasionally, not out of concern, but out of courtesy. The act was small, easily folded into the spaces between other moments. Each time he looked, everything was as it had been. Nothing went wrong. The responsibility remained gentle. It did not announce itself as burden or obligation. It rested lightly in the background like a thought that did not need to be finished. Over time, he noticed that his awareness began to include it without effort. Not because he was trying to remember, but because remembering had become natural. The task did not interrupt his attention. It joined it. Being entrusted did not feel like holding tightly. It felt like keeping something in mind without urgency and without fear. There was room for other things, space for rest. For now, watching over something did not require vigilance. It required presence, and presence at this stage did not cost him anything. He did not know how long the task would last. He did not ask. There was no need to anticipate what had not yet arrived. The responsibility remained simple, and simplicity for the moment was enough. At some point, without a clear beginning, his attention stopped drifting away. Nothing had changed in what he was asked to watch over. It remained quiet, unchanged, offering no signal that it required more care than before. Yet his awareness no longer returned to it only by choice. It lingered, while walking a part of him stayed with it. While resting, it remained faintly present. Even when nothing reminded him, the thought did not fully leave. This did not arrive as worry. It arrived as attentiveness. He noticed himself checking more often, not because something felt wrong, but because it felt unfinished to not check. The act was still small, still easy, but it no longer disappeared after it was done. Attention began to stretch. It did not ask for permission. It simply occupied more space than before. Not loudly, not urgently, just steadily. At first, this felt like care, deepening, like responsibility maturing into reliability. He told himself this was natural, that this was what it meant to be trusted. And yet something subtle shifted. Moments that once felt complete on their own now carried an edge of incompletion. His mind would gently return again and again to what he was watching over. Not because it demanded him, but because he had begun to include it everywhere. The task itself had not grown heavier. His attention had. He did not feel strained. He did not feel burdened, but he noticed fewer moments of absence, fewer spaces where nothing followed him. Rest began to share space with awareness. Silence became slightly occupied. Still nothing felt wrong. He adjusted without resistance, believing this was simply the shape responsibility takes when it settles in. Attention, after all, is not effort when it moves quietly. For now it only stayed. And staying at this stage still felt safe. At first, the idea of stepping away still seemed available to him. Not as an action, but as a possibility. Something he could do later if needed. But gradually that possibility thinned. He noticed it most in the smallest moments. When he tried to turn his attention elsewhere, there was a faint resistance, not strong enough to stop him, but present enough to be felt. A quiet hesitation, like pausing at the edge of a room before leaving. Nothing pulled him back sharply, nothing demanded. Yet letting go no longer felt empty. It felt unfinished. He told himself this was normal, that meaning grows where attention stays, that care naturally develops a gravity of its own. And for a while this explanation was enough. But something subtle had shifted in his body. The ease that once accompanied attention had been replaced by a mild vigilance. Not anxiety exactly, more like readiness. As if something might need him at any moment, even though nothing ever did. Rest was still possible, but it was no longer complete. When he slept, part of him remained lightly alert. When he breathed, awareness lingered just beyond the breath. Even silence felt slightly monitored. Letting go, once simple, now carried weight. He realized then that attachment does not always announce itself through fear. Sometimes it arrives as responsibility that never rests, as presence that forgets how to leave. There was no clear moment when this happened. No decision, no mistake. Just a gradual tightening around something that had once been held gently, and yet he still did not call it a burden, because it had grown slowly, because it felt meaningful, because releasing it now seemed to imply loss. So he stayed. Not because he had to, but because stepping away no longer felt neutral. And in that barely noticeable shift, attention had crossed a threshold it did not yet recognize. Over time, the cost did not announce itself. It did not arrive as exhaustion or complaint. It appeared as subtle narrowing. Choices became fewer without him noticing. Not because options disappeared, but because attention was already occupied before new possibilities could fully form. He still moved through his days as before. He spoke, listened, rested. Yet each moment now carried a faint background tension, as though part of him was always slightly turned toward what he was watching over. Nothing demanded urgency, nothing asked to be solved. And yet presence had become divided. He noticed this most clearly during moments that once felt spacious, walking without destination, sitting without purpose, letting the mind soften on its own. These moments still happened, but they were thinner, less complete. Attention did not leave entirely. It hovered. Staying had become a habit, a quiet loyalty to something that no longer needed guarding yet felt unsafe to abandon. He told himself this was maturity, that this was how responsibility deepens, how care becomes reliable. And perhaps this was partly true. But another truth lived beneath it. By staying, he had slowly stopped trusting absence. By remaining attentive, he had forgotten how to rest fully. Nothing dramatic had been lost, only lightness. The cost was not pain, it was weight, not heavy enough to collapse under, just enough to be carried everywhere. He did not resent it. He did not question it openly. He simply adapted as people often do to the quiet accumulation of what once felt meaningful. And still something in him sensed that staying was no longer free. That what had begun as gentle care had quietly transformed into a presence that no longer knew how to step back. This realization did not ask for action, it only waited. The softening did not come as a decision. It arrived the way breath deepens on its own when the body feels safe. One moment, attention was still holding. The next, it loosened just enough to be noticed. Nothing had changed in what he was watching over. There was no signal that release was permitted, no reassurance that absence would cause no harm, and yet, something inside him paused. Not to leave, just to stop tightening. He noticed a small space appear between awareness and responsibility, a pause where attention no longer leaned forward automatically. It did not retreat, it simply rested. For the first time in a long while, nothing followed him for a few breaths. The feeling was unfamiliar, not relief exactly, more like quiet. The kind that does not ask to be filled. He let it remain. When awareness returned, it did so without urgency. It touched lightly, then withdrew again, as if testing whether it was still allowed to move freely. No consequence appeared. Nothing collapsed. Nothing called him back. This absence was not abandonment. It was trust forming slowly. He realized then that holding does not always need to be undone. Sometimes it only needs to be loosened enough for breath to pass through. Care could remain without tension, presence without vigilance. The task did not disappear, but it no longer occupied every corner of his awareness. What surprised him most was not the ease of letting go, but how little had been required to begin. Not courage, not certainty, only a moment of not tightening further. And in that moment, attention remembered something it had forgotten, that it knows how to come and go. When he no longer held it in the same way, something unexpected revealed itself. What remained did not fade. It did not require his attention to continue. The space that opened felt wider than he had imagined. Not empty, but calm, like a room after everyone has quietly left, still warm with presence, yet free of movement. He noticed that awareness now returned only when it was needed. It came without effort and left without trace. No part of him followed it afterward. Nothing had been lost. The sense of responsibility had not vanished. It had simply stopped clinging to his awareness. Care existed without tension, presence without weight. In the absence of constant holding, something softer became possible. Silence deepened, not as absence but as a resting place, Thought slowed, then thinned. Even the idea of watching over something felt distant, unnecessary. Breath moved without being followed. Moments passed without being marked. He realized then that what truly mattered had never depended on his vigilance. That attention, when trusted, organizes itself naturally. Nothing needed guarding anymore. And in that realization, the need to stay dissolved completely. There was no ending to mark this shift, no sense of accomplishment, just a gentle settling like sleep, arriving before being noticed. Awareness did not disappear. It rested. Fives. Once attention no longer needed to stay, another question surfaced quietly. If nothing is being held, what remains to keep us safe? At first, the unease did not feel emotional. It felt structural, as though something essential had been removed, not from his life, but from the way life had been organized inside him. Without holding time, felt wider. Moments arrived without direction. Nothing pointed clearly to what mattered most. And in that openness, a question lingered quietly beneath everything else. If nothing is being held, what keeps things from falling apart? He noticed how often his sense of safety had depended on subtle acts of holding, watching, anticipating, staying slightly ahead of what might be needed. These habits had once given shape to his days, offering a sense of continuity. Without them, there was space, and space felt unfamiliar, not threatening, but unguarded. He found himself wanting to re-establish something small, a routine, a mental marker, a reason to stay alert. Not because anything required it, but because it had always been there before. Safety, he realized, had never been the absence of danger. It had been the presence of control. Letting go removed that illusion, gently but completely. And what remained was not danger but uncertainty without scaffolding. He did not panic. He simply noticed the impulse to tighten again. The urge was quiet, reasonable, almost kind. It whispered that holding had worked before, that vigilance had kept things intact, that releasing it fully might invite collapse. Nothing actually moved, nothing broke, yet the body remembered how to prepare. Breath shortened slightly. Awareness leaned forward again. And in that moment, he understood something important. That what felt unsafe was not the absence of holding, but the unfamiliarity of trusting without it. The habit had formed so quietly that he rarely noticed it. Long before, he understood why his attention had learned to stay slightly awake, even in moments meant for rest. Not fully tense, just ready, ready to adjust, ready to respond, ready to intervene if needed. This readiness had once felt responsible, even caring. It kept things smooth, prevented surprises, filled the small gaps before they could become problems. Over time, it became automatic. The body remembered before the mind did. Shoulders lifted almost imperceptibly. Breath stayed just a little higher in the chest. Awareness hovered, never fully settling. He did not think of this as effort. It had been present for so long that it felt like a natural baseline, and now, without something to watch over, the habit revealed itself. It looked for a place to land. When nothing appeared, it remained suspended. Not uncomfortable enough to demand attention, but persistent enough to be felt. He noticed this most clearly at night. Lying still, eyes closed, the body relaxed, but did not fully release. A faint vigilance lingered, as though listening for something that never came. Nothing arrived, yet the habit stayed. It was not driven by fear, it was driven by familiarity. Alertness had become synonymous with safety. rest with risk. Letting go asked him to experience something he had rarely allowed himself. Unmonitored ease, and that felt strangely exposed. Not because danger was present, but because the usual signals of control were absent. He did not force the habit away. He simply noticed it. And in noticing, something loosened. Awareness no longer identified with the need to stay alert. It observed the habit the way one might observe a sound fading in the distance. Still present, less convincing, rest did not arrive all at once. At first it came in brief moments, a few breaths where nothing was monitored, a pause where awareness did not lean forward or look ahead. Then it faded again. He did not chase it. Each time rest appeared, it felt less like an action and more like permission. Permission to not oversee, to not remain slightly ahead of the moment. The body responded first. Breath deepened on its own. Shoulders softened without instruction. The subtle readiness that had once lived in his muscles began to dissolve, not because it was pushed away, but because it was no longer needed. Nothing replaced it. And in that absence, something new was allowed to surface. Ease without purpose. It felt unfamiliar, almost too quiet, as though something important had been forgotten. Yet nothing was missing. He noticed that when awareness stopped watching, experience continued without interruption. Sounds rose and fell. Sensations shifted gently. Time passed without needing to be managed. There was no collapse, no loss of control, only continuation. This realization did not arrive as insight. It arrived as settling. Rest was not something he had to enter. It was already there, waiting beneath the habit of staying alert. As attention softened further, even the distinction between rest and awareness began to blur. There was no longer a sense of someone resting or someone watching. Just stillness occasionally touched by thought, then untouched again. Sleep had not yet arrived, but its doorway had opened, and for the first time, nothing stood guard at the threshold. At some point, the idea of guarding no longer made sense, not because he had decided to stop, but because there was nothing left that required it. Awareness remained, but it had lost its edges. It no longer scanned or checked. It simply rested within experience as it unfolded. Breath moved without being followed. Sound arrived without being named. Thought appeared and dissolved without drawing attention. There was no watcher standing apart from what was happening. Even the memory of vigilance felt distant, like a habit from another life. The sense of safety that once depended on holding had softened into something quieter. Not protection, but trust. Trust that life continues without supervision. Trust that presence does not need to manage itself. In this state, nothing felt unfinished. Moments did not point forward or backward. They arrived, stayed briefly, and left without taking anything with them. There was no effort to stay, no effort to let go, only continuation. If fear had once whispered that letting go was dangerous, that voice had grown faint. Not silenced, but no longer believed. Nothing had proven it wrong. Everything had simply kept moving. And in that movement, he found himself no longer inside the story of safety and risk. The body rested deeply now. Muscles released fully. The breath settled into its own rhythm, steady and unobserved. Awareness did not disappear. It blended. There was no boundary where rest ended and awareness began. Only a gentle, uninterrupted flow. Sleep approached without announcement, and nothing stood in its way. When nothing remained to guard, movement continued on its own. Not guided, not observed, simply unfolding at a pace that did not ask to be followed. The path did not disappear when he stopped watching it. It continued quietly, without asking to be noticed. At first, this felt disorienting. He was used to tracking where he was going, even when the destination was unclear. There had always been a sense of forward movement, measured and confirmed by attention. Now movement happened without commentary. Steps unfolded without being counted. Time passed without being marked. There was no inner voice confirming progress or correcting direction. And still, nothing went wrong. He realized that the path had never depended on his observation to exist. It had only required his presence, not his supervision. Without the need to follow, the experience of moving softened. The body adjusted naturally to the ground beneath it. Pace found its own rhythm, sometimes slowing, sometimes pausing without explanation. There was no urgency to arrive. The idea of destination faded into the background, replaced by the simple fact of being in motion. Awareness remained, but it no longer stood apart from the movement. It flowed with it, inseparable, like water moving within water. There was no sense of losing control, only the absence of needing it. He noticed that when attention stopped tracking, progress effort diminished. Muscles worked less, breath aligned itself, even thought appeared less frequently, as if unsure where to attach. Nothing needed to be decided. The path unfolded because unfolding was its nature. In this way, movement became rest, not stillness but ease within motion. And in that ease, the distinction between watching and walking dissolved completely. Without direction, movement did not become chaotic. It became quieter. There was no inner map unfolding ahead of each step. No subtle checking to see whether progress was being made. The body moved as it needed to, responding to terrain, balance, and pace without commentary. This absence of direction felt strange at first. Not empty, but unframed, as if the usual outlines that gave shape to experience had gently dissolved. And still movement continued. He noticed that when direction was no longer imposed, pauses appeared naturally, not as interruptions, but as part of the same flow. Stopping did not mean falling behind. It simply meant stillness within motion. Time softened. Moments no longer leaned toward what came next. They existed fully, then released themselves without residue. Awareness did not guide the path. It accompanied it. There was no sense of being lost, only the absence of needing to know where he was. Thoughts arose less frequently now. When they did, they passed through like distant echoes, not asking to be followed or resolved. The body seemed to understand something the mind had long tried to manage. That direction is not always required for continuity. Breath moved in rhythm with steps. Muscles adjusted without instruction. Balance found itself again and again effortlessly. In this way, movement became self-sustaining, not driven, not watched, simply allowed. He realized that much of what he once called purpose had been a form of tension, a way of pulling experience toward an imagined future. Without that pull, there was no lack, only presence moving gently through itself. The path did not need to be followed. It needed only to be walked. Effort did not end with a clear signal. It faded the way tension leaves the body when it is no longer needed. He did not decide to stop trying. Trying simply lost its purpose. There was no longer anything ahead that required reaching. No point behind that needed correcting. Movement continued, but without the subtle push that had once lived beneath each step. The body adjusted first. Muscles softened where they had once held. Breath settled into a rhythm that did not respond to thought. Even posture found ease without instruction. Awareness noticed this only afterward. Effort had been present for so long that its absence felt almost like something missing, a familiar pressure no longer there. And yet nothing felt incomplete. He realized that much of what he once called effort had been anticipation, a leaning toward what had not yet arrived, a quiet insistence that something needed to be shaped or guided. Without anticipation, there was nothing to push against. Experience unfolded at its own pace, sometimes slower, sometimes still, sometimes moving again without warning. There was no resistance to these changes. When effort released itself, attention did not scatter. It deepened, not by focusing, but by settling into what was already happening. Sounds seemed farther apart, sensations softer, thoughts less frequent, as if unsure where to attach. Even the sense of being someone moving through a path began to thin. There was movement, there was awareness, but the space between them dissolved. Nothing needed to be done to maintain this state. It did not require protection or repetition. Effort had stepped aside, and in its place there was ease without intention. The path did not require his attention to continue. It had never asked for it. When effort stepped aside, movement did not stop. It simply reorganized itself around what was already present. The ground offered support, balance adjusted, pace found its own measure. Nothing needed to be confirmed. He noticed that even when awareness drifted, the body remained steady. Even when thought dissolved into quiet, movement did not lose its way. The path carried itself. There was a gentle confidence in this realization. Not excitement, not relief, just recognition. He had mistaken watching for guiding, and guiding for necessity. Without either, life did not pause. Moments arrived without needing interpretation. They passed without leaving weight behind. There was no sense of falling behind or moving ahead. Only continuity. Awareness now rested inside the movement rather than above it. It did not track progress, it did not anticipate change. It remained present without preference. In this state, even the idea of a path softened. There was movement, yes, but no one walking it. Breath moved, sound drifted, sensation rose and fell. Everything continued without reference to effort or intention. And in that continuation, sleep drew nearer. Not as an event, but as a deepening of the same ease. Nothing needed to be guarded. Nothing needed to be followed. The path continued. Ives. After movement no longer needed direction, stillness revealed itself in a different way. Not as emptiness, but as a space that remained gentle even after everything had passed through. The room did not change when movement ended. Nothing rearranged itself to mark the transition. No signal announced that everything had passed through. And yet, something unmistakable had settled. The air felt different, not heavier, not lighter, simply undisturbed. The space remained as it was holding the faint impression of what had moved within it. Not memory, not residue, just a quiet awareness that something had been here and was no longer. No one entered, no one needed to. The room did not wait, it rested. Light softened without being noticed. Shadows lengthened and then became still. The floor supported nothing, yet did not feel empty. Walls stood without enclosing anything. Time slowed, then thinned. Moments no longer pointed toward what might happen next. They arrived complete, then released themselves without asking to be carried forward. The room did not observe itself. It did not reflect. It simply remained. In this stillness, awareness did not gather around objects or edges. It spread gently like warmth settling into a space that no longer required attention. Nothing called for response. Even the idea of staying felt unnecessary. The room did not hold silence as an absence. It held it as presence without movement. And in that presence, something eased. The need to name, the need to follow, the need to remain alert. All of it softened into the same quiet continuity. There was no threshold to cross here. Only a gradual recognition that nothing needed to be added. The room was already complete. The sound had already passed. It did not fade dramatically, nor did it announce its leaving. It simply reached a point where it was no longer present and nothing followed to replace it. The room did not notice. Silence did not arrive as something new. It had always been there, waiting beneath the movement of sound, patient and unchanged. What remained was not quiet in contrast to noise. It was quiet without comparison. No echo returned to confirm what had been heard. No memory of sound lingered to be revisited. The air rested without vibration and the walls held nothing back. The absence did not feel empty. It felt complete. There was no listening now, no subtle leaning toward what might come next. Ears did not search the space. Attention did not gather. Sound was no longer expected. Time softened further in this stillness. Without sound to mark its passing moments, lost their edges. They did not begin or end clearly. They simply unfolded, then dissolved. The room did not resist this change. It did not fill the space with anticipation. It did not hold silence tightly, as if afraid of losing it. Silence remained because nothing disturbed it. Awareness did not attach itself to the quiet. It did not label it or measure it. It rested within it lightly, as though resting were the most natural response. Nothing asked to be heard. Nothing waited to return. The room continued to exist without sound, unchanged by its absence, steady and sufficient. And in that steadiness, the sense of needing to listen softened completely. There was no signal to follow. Only the gentle persistence of stillness, holding everything without effort. The objects remained where they were. Nothing shifted to draw attention. Nothing stood out to be noticed. The room held its shapes without asking to be seen. Surfaces rested in place. Corners softened. Distances between things felt less defined, as though space itself had relaxed. There was no urge to look. Objects did not present themselves as separate anymore. They existed without edges that needed tracing, without names that needed remembering. A table was no longer a table. A wall, no longer a wall. They were simply there. Awareness did not settle on any single point. It spread gently across the room, then thinned no longer, distinguishing one form from another. Attention did not move from object to object. It hovered without landing. Nothing required confirmation. The room did not organize itself around meaning. There was no center of interest, no hierarchy of importance. Everything shared the same quiet status, equally present, equally unremarkable. In this way, the sense of inside and outside softened further. Objects no longer stood apart from the space that held them. They blended into the same stillness supported without effort. Time lost another layer of structure. Without attention attaching itself to things, moments slipped past without leaving impressions. Memory did not form. Expectation did not arise. The need to recognize faded. Awareness remained, but it was no longer directed. It did not search for anchors. It rested within the room as a whole, then loosened even that sense of wholeness. Objects continued to exist without being attended to. And in their quiet persistence, something else released. The habit of noticing, the impulse to focus. Both dissolved gently, leaving only a soft, unbroken presence where nothing needed to be held in mind. Time no longer pointed anywhere. There was no earlier moment to return to, no later moment to prepare for. The sense of sequence softened until it could no longer be followed. Moments arrived without edges. They did not begin clearly, and they did not conclude. One did not replace another. They simply appeared, rested briefly, and dissolved without leaving marks behind them. The room did not measure this. Clocks, if they existed, no longer mattered. There was nothing to count toward, nothing to count away from. The usual markers that once divided experience into pieces had loosened their hold. Awareness did not try to keep track. Without reference, time became spacious, not long, not short, just open enough that nothing felt rushed or delayed. Waiting disappeared, so did arriving. The idea of duration lost its meaning when there was nothing moving toward an outcome. Experience no longer leaned forward. It settled where it was then quietly settled again. Breath moved within this openness, steady and unobserved. Sensation drifted in and out without being timed. Thought, when it appeared at all, had no place to attach itself. Memory did not form. Expectation did not arise. The room existed without asking how long it had been there or how long it would remain. It did not age. It did not anticipate change. Time, having lost its references, no longer structured experience. It became background, and in that background rest deepened. There was no pressure to stay awake, no pressure to fall asleep. Only a gentle continuity where moments did not accumulate and nothing needed to be carried forward. Time rested. The room did not close when everything had passed through. There was no final gesture, no sense of completion that asked to be marked. Doors did not need to be shut. Openings did not need to be sealed. The space remained as it was available without expectation. Nothing was kept out. Nothing was held in. The room did not guard itself. It did not protect its quiet. It did not worry that something might disturb what had settled. Stillness stayed without effort, not because it was maintained, but because nothing challenged it. Air moved freely, almost imperceptibly. Light rested where it fell. Shadows did not gather or retreat. The room existed without preference for what entered or what left. Awareness felt this openness without naming it. There was no sense of being inside or outside. Boundaries softened to the point of irrelevance. The space did not separate itself from what surrounded it. It blended gently into the larger quiet. Nothing needed to be finished here. The idea of closure no longer applied. Experience did not require an ending to feel complete. It rested in continuity, unbroken and unremarkable. The room did not wait for the next moment. It did not remember the last. It simply remained. In this openness, rest deepened further. Not as sleep yet, but as readiness for it. A state where nothing needed attention and nothing asked to be resolved. The room stayed quiet after everyone left. not empty, not full. Just open enough for whatever came next to arrive without resistance. And in that openness, the sense of moving on softened, giving way to the quiet transition that followed naturally without signal or instruction. As the room remained open, night arrived without request. It did not ask to be noticed, only to be allowed to continue in its own quiet way. Well, night did not arrive with an instruction. It did not ask for attention or for a shift in posture or for readiness. It did not require eyes to close or thoughts to slow. It simply settled the way darkness settles when light no longer insists on staying. There was nothing to prepare for. The night did not expect awareness to meet it. It did not wait to be acknowledged. It continued whether it was noticed or not, steady and unhurried. In this way, night felt different from rest that had been attempted before. It did not offer guidance. It did not suggest how to be with it. It removed the need to do anything at all. Awareness did not lean toward it. It did not pull away either. The space softened as night deepened, but nothing changed suddenly. Shadows did not claim the room. They simply blended into it, losing distinction as edges grew less important. Sound, if it appeared, did not interrupt. It passed through without being held. Silence did not follow it as a contrast. Both existed together without effort. The body responded quietly. Breath slowed without being guided. Muscles released without instruction. There was no sense of being invited to relax. Relaxation happened on its own, as though the night itself carried that permission. Nothing needed to be watched. Night did not threaten to disappear if attention drifted. It did not require participation to continue. It asked for nothing, and because of that, nothing was withheld. Time thinned further, losing its markers. There was no need to remember what had come before or anticipate what might follow. The night did not care whether anyone was awake or asleep. It simply remained. And in that absence of demand, awareness softened naturally, resting where it was without effort and without concern. Darkness did not arrive as a signal to stop. It arrived as permission. Not the kind that is granted or requested, but the kind that exists quietly, waiting to be recognized. When light loosened its hold, nothing was lost. What remained did not need to be seen to be present. Darkness did not conceal anything important. It did not threaten. It did not demand trust. It simply reduced the need to manage what was already there. In the absence of light, attention softened. There was less to track, fewer edges to follow. The impulse to scan the space eased naturally, as though the eyes themselves understood that nothing more was required. The body responded first. Muscles released where they had been holding lightly. Breath deepened without instruction. Posture adjusted on its own, finding a shape that did not need to be maintained. Darkness did not ask the mind to quiet. The mind quieted because there was nothing left to organize. Thoughts, when they appeared, felt less substantial. They moved without weight passing through, without pulling awareness along with them. There was no contrast between inside and outside, no need to distinguish one from the other. Darkness allowed everything to blend. Time softened further, losing its urgency. Moments no longer pressed forward. They did not pile up. They rested, then dissolved. There was no sense of being hidden, only of being unobserved. And in that unobserved space, the effort to remain present eased. Awareness did not need to hold itself together. It rested within experience as it unfolded without commentary. Darkness did not insist on sleep. It allowed it, and in allowing it removed the last quiet reasons to stay awake. Awareness did not disappear. It thinned, not suddenly and not completely. It softened the way mist softens the edges of a landscape, leaving forms present but less distinct, less demanding. There was no effort involved in this change. Nothing was being released on purpose. Awareness simply loosened its grip on clarity, no longer needing to define what it touched. Thoughts still appeared from time to time. They arrived quietly without structure and drifted away before forming connections. They did not lead anywhere. They did not ask to be followed. Attention no longer gathered itself tightly. It spread, not outward and not inward, just less concentrated, less interested in staying whole. Sensations faded into one another. The body was still present, but it no longer stood apart as something to be monitored. Breath moved, but awareness did not stay with it. Sound existed, but it did not anchor experience. Everything became lighter. Even the sense of being aware softened. There was no clear line between noticing and not noticing. Awareness rested in a state where nothing needed to be held clearly enough to remain. Time lost another layer of definition. Moments no longer felt separate. They blended, overlapping gently without sequence or distinction. This thinning did not feel like loss. It felt like relief without emotion. The effort to stay present had already dissolved, and now the effort to remain aware faded with it. What remained was not blankness, but a quiet continuity that did not depend on attention. Awareness did not fall asleep. It drifted, and in that drifting, the space for sleep widened naturally without invitation and without resistance. Nothing needed to happen next. Thoughts still appeared, but they no longer carried weight. They arrived softly without urgency, like shapes passing behind closed eyes. There was no need to examine them, no impulse to follow where they might lead. They did not insist. A thought would surface, briefly, incomplete, then fade, before it could gather meaning. Another might appear, then dissolve even faster, leaving no trace of connection behind it. Nothing linked them together. Awareness did not engage. It did not resist either. Thoughts were allowed to pass in the same way. Sound had once passed through the room, noticed only if noticed and forgotten immediately afterward. Without attention feeding them, thoughts grew lighter. They no longer pulled the body toward action or the mind toward memory. They floated, then thinned, then disappeared entirely as though they had never been there. Even the sense of having thoughts softened. There was no longer a clear distinction between thinking and not thinking. Experience did not pause to label either state. It simply continued quietly and evenly. The body rested deeper now. Breath moved somewhere in the background, steady and unobserved. Muscles released fully, no longer preparing or adjusting. Sensation became diffuse, spreading gently until it was no longer centered anywhere in particular. Time lost its last firm outlines. Moments did not accumulate. They did not stack or progress. They arrived whole, then faded without replacement. Thoughts, having lost their weight, no longer marked these moments. They did not define them or interrupt them. What remained was a soft continuity, uninterrupted by meaning or direction. Sleep was close now, not approaching, not arriving, simply present as a possibility that no longer needed to be resisted. And as thoughts continued to lose their weight, the space they once occupied opened into quiet rest, steady and undisturbed. The night did not narrow as awareness softened. It widened, not by expanding outward, but by removing the need for anything to be held apart. What remained was a quiet inclusiveness, steady and unremarkable. Everything belonged here. Sound, if it appeared, was carried without resistance. Silence did not oppose it. Both rested within the same depth, neither interrupting the other. Thoughts had little presence now. When they surfaced, they were light enough to pass through without leaving impressions. Most of the time, nothing rose to replace them. The body rested fully inside the night. Breath moved somewhere within it, slow and unobserved. Sensation spread evenly, no longer centered on any one place. There was no signal to adjust, no need to check whether rest was happening. It was. Time no longer felt separate from experience. It did not move forward or pause. It did not need to be measured. Moments arrived and faded within the same gentle holding. The night did not watch over this. It did not guide or protect. It simply held. Nothing needed to be excluded. Nothing needed to be managed. Even the idea of sleeping softened, losing its importance. There was no pressure to fall asleep, no effort to remain awake. Both were unnecessary within this quiet containment. Awareness did not disappear. It rested diffuse and uncentered without needing to define itself. The night continued to hold everything without preference, and within that, holding the last traces of effort, dissolved, leaving only a steady calm that did not point anywhere else. Sleep no longer approached. It waited nowhere. It was already present, folded gently into the same quiet that held everything else. As the night held everything without effort, breath continued on its own. Not guided, not corrected, simply happening in the quiet it had always known. Breath continued without needing to be noticed. It moved in its own way, at its own pace, without waiting for attention to follow it. There was no instruction being given and none required. The body already knew what to do. Inhale arrived quietly. Exhale left just as softly. Nothing marked the transition between them. There was no count to keep, no rhythm to maintain. Breath did not belong to anyone. It simply happened where it had always happened. Awareness did not stay with it. Sometimes it brushed past, then drifted away again. Sometimes it did not touch breath at all, and still, breath continued steady and unremarkable. The chest rose and fell without effort. The belly softened. Muscles nearby released their last small tensions, no longer preparing or holding. There was no sense of doing this correctly. Breath was not an exercise, it was not a tool. It was simply the body continuing. In this simplicity, the body felt less separate. Sensation spread evenly, losing its center. The boundary between breath and rest softened as though both belonged to the same quiet process. Thoughts rarely appeared now. When they did, they passed without interrupting the rhythm. Breath did not respond to them. It did not change to accommodate attention. Time remained indistinct. Moments did not stack or progress. They moved in the same way. Breath moved, arriving, leaving and leaving nothing behind. The body rested more deeply with each cycle, not because breath was guiding it, but because nothing was interfering. Awareness did not need to let go. It had already loosened. Breath continued without instruction, and in that continuation the body remembered how to rest on its own, quietly and completely. The body did not need to be reminded. Rest was not something new to learn. It was something remembered quietly, without instruction or effort. Muscles softened in places that had been holding lightly for hours, perhaps longer. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just enough for tension to lose its purpose. Weight settled. The surface beneath the body offered support without commentary. There was no need to adjust or check for comfort. Comfort arrived on its own as the body recognized that nothing more was required. Breath continued somewhere in the background, steady and unobserved. With each cycle, the body released a little more, not because it was guided to do so, but because release felt natural here. Sensation became diffuse. There was no single point of focus. Warmth, pressure, and stillness blended together, no longer asking to be named or separated. The sense of having a body softened into the sense of being supported. The body remembered how to rest deeply the way it had done countless times before without thought or intention. It did not analyze the moment. It did not wonder whether rest was happening correctly. It simply rested. Awareness drifted in and out of this remembering, sometimes present, sometimes distant, never needed. The body did not depend on attention to continue. Time thinned further. There was no sequence of moments to follow. Rest did not deepen by stages. It was already present, waiting beneath habit and effort. Even the idea of sleep felt less important now. Whether sleep arrived soon or later no longer mattered. The body had already entered a state that did not require decision. Rest was not a goal. It was a condition the body had returned to. And in that return, everything slowed naturally, without signal, without direction, and without the need to hold anything in mind. Awareness did not decide to follow the breath. It found itself there naturally, as though drawn by the simplicity of something that did not need to be managed. Breath moved and awareness moved with it, not closely, not attentively, just enough to remain nearby. There was no effort to stay aligned. Sometimes awareness touched the rhythm briefly, then drifted away again. Sometimes it stayed for a few cycles, then loosened its hold without explanation. Breath did not change in response. It continued exactly as before. Nothing required synchronization. The space between breaths felt as present as the breaths themselves. Pauses appeared without being noticed, then passed without being marked. Awareness did not wait for the next inhale. It did not anticipate the exhale. It simply accompanied what was already happening. In this quiet following, the sense of separation softened further. Awareness no longer felt like something observing from a distance. It felt embedded, resting within the same movement it noticed. Thoughts were rare now. When they appeared, they did not interrupt. They slipped through gently, like faint ripples that did not disturb the surface beneath them. Breath continued, unaware of their presence. The body rested deeply, supported without question. Sensation spread evenly, no longer pointing toward any one place. There was no center to experience. Time dissolved into rhythm. Not measured, not counted. Just a gentle continuity that did not require memory or expectation. Moments did not accumulate. They flowed. Awareness followed breath only because breath was there. There was no intention to remain awake, no intention to fall asleep. Both felt unnecessary. As awareness drifted alongside breath, it thinned further, becoming less defined with each quiet moment. not disappearing but loosening as though preparing to step aside without needing to say so. Breath continued, and awareness, having followed it gently for a while, began to rest even more deeply, no longer needing to follow anything at all. Between one breath and the next, there was a pause that did not announce itself. It did not ask to be noticed. It did not arrive with significance. It simply existed quietly, like a doorway no one needed to walk through. The body did not wait for it. The breath did not prepare for it. And yet it was always there. In that small stillness, nothing happened. No movement forward, no movement back. Just a soft suspension where effort had no place and intention had nothing to do. The pause did not belong to the inhale or the exhale. It was not part of either. It stood on its own, complete, unoccupied. Awareness did not settle there on purpose. It drifted into the pause the way a leaf drifts into a calm pocket of water, without choosing, without resistance. There was no sense of holding, no sense of release. Only a gentle neutrality where the body rested without needing to rest, and the mind softened without being asked to soften. Thoughts, if they appeared at all, felt distant. They no longer pressed forward. They no longer waited for response. They faded before finishing their shape. The pause did not extend time. It removed it. Moments stopped lining up. There was no before and no after, only this quiet interval that did not demand continuation. Breath resumed when it was ready, not because something signaled it to. The pause made no claim on what followed. And when the next pause arrived, it felt familiar, as though nothing had changed, even though everything had slowed. Here, effort could not survive. Here, awareness had nothing to manage. The pause was not empty. It was complete, and as attention thinned further, even the pause no longer needed to be noticed. It remained, whether recognized or not. Breath continued, pauses appeared and disappeared, and somewhere within that rhythm, awareness rested, no longer following, no longer drifting, simply no longer interfering. At some point, attention stopped looking, not because it was told to, not because it grew tired. It simply no longer felt the need to search. There was nothing missing. Breath continued, pauses appeared and dissolved, and attention, once inclined to hover, to follow, to notice, softened into stillness without announcing its arrival. It did not turn inward. It did not turn outward. It rested where it already was. Without looking, there was no distance between awareness and experience, no edge where one ended and the other began. Sensation existed but without being examined. Sound arose but without being named. Even the sense of listening faded. The body remained present yet undefined. Weight was there but it did not press. Warmth existed but it did not draw focus. Everything was allowed, nothing emphasized. Thoughts appeared only as faint impressions, incomplete and unformed. They passed before becoming words like echoes that never reached a wall. There was no effort to let them go. There was no effort to keep them. They were simply unnecessary. When attention stopped looking, time loosened completely. The mind no longer tracked progress or sequence. There was no sense of moving toward sleep or away from wakefulness. Both had lost relevance. In this quiet, awareness did not disappear. It thinned, it spread. It became less like a point and more like an atmosphere, present everywhere, focused nowhere. Nothing needed to be understood. Nothing needed to be held. Breath moved on its own. The body rested on its own. And attention, no longer searching for anything to attend to, rested as well, not fixed, not drifting, simply still. This was not concentration. This was not absence. It was the ease that arrives when nothing is required. And from here, there was nowhere else to go. Rest arrived without anyone noticing it arrive. There was no moment of recognition, no thought saying now resting, no observer stepping forward to witness the change. The body was already resting. Awareness was already quiet. What remained was not an experience being had, but a condition being allowed. Breath continued somewhere, but without location. It was not in the chest or the abdomen. It was simply part of the same softness that held everything else. There was no center from which rest was perceived. Sensation existed without ownership. Sound appeared without direction, then dissolved without echo. Even the sense of being present became unnecessary. In this space, nothing was watching the body sleep. Nothing was waiting to drift off. There was only rest resting in itself. The boundary between awareness and sleep thinned until it no longer mattered which word applied. Awareness did not leave. Sleep did not begin. The distinction lost relevance. Thoughts no longer formed. Not because they were pushed away, but because there was no place for them to land. No surface firm enough to hold them. Time was absent here. Sequence had no meaning. The body continued its quiet rhythms, guided by something older than intention. Muscles softened without instruction. Breath adjusted without decision. Rest deepened without deepening. Nothing moved forward. Nothing pulled back. And because there was no observer, there was no one left to try to understand what was happening. This was not unconsciousness. This was not awareness. It was the place where both no longer needed names. Here, nothing needed to be remembered. Nothing needed to be carried. And if sleep came, it came gently without crossing a threshold. And if awareness remained, it remained just as quietly. Either way, there was nothing left to do. And as rest remained without needing to be observed, the world beyond thought grew quieter still, as if an entire place had begun to soften into silence. The village did not fall asleep all at once. It softened gradually, like a sound fading beyond hearing rather than stopping. Lights dimmed without intention. Doors closed without ceremony. Even footsteps seemed to lose their weight as they crossed familiar ground. No signal was given. No moment marked the change. Windows reflected only darkness now, though inside rooms still held the warmth of the day. Tables remembered conversations that had already loosened their shape. Cups rested where hands had set them down, not waiting to be lifted again. The air itself felt slower. Somewhere, a clock continued its patient movement, though no one listened for it. Time passed without being noticed, without being counted. It moved the way water moves in the deep, present but unannounced. The village streets remained exactly as they were, yet something essential had shifted. Sound no longer traveled far. A distant door closing arrived without echo. Even the wind seemed to pass through without disturbing anything. Nothing was missing. Nothing was added. Houses stood quietly, not guarding their contents, not protecting what was inside. They simply held space the way they had learned to do over many nights like this. Inside one home, a chair sat slightly turned as if someone had stood and forgotten to return it. Inside another, a curtain rested unevenly, paused mid-motion, and left there. These small details remained, but they no longer asked to be noticed. The village did not watch itself become quiet. It did not remember how it sounded before. Silence arrived not as absence, but as a gentle agreement, a shared understanding that nothing more needed to happen. Breath continued behind closed doors. Hearts kept their steady rhythm, and as the night settled deeper, the village did not disappear. It remained held together, not by activity or awareness, but by the simple fact of being allowed to rest. Sound did not disappear. It simply lost its audience. Somewhere within the village, a floorboard adjusted under its own weight. Farther away, a branch shifted against a wall. These small movements still occurred, but they no longer traveled outward in search of attention. They ended where they began. No ear leaned toward them. No mind assembled meaning from them. The night held every sound the way water holds a stone, completely without response. Inside the houses, breath moved quietly through sleeping bodies. It did not announce itself. It did not synchronize. Each rhythm found its own pace, unobserved and uninterrupted. A kettle cooled on a stove. A book rested open where pages had stopped turning. Nothing waited to be resumed. The village existed in this state, before words could describe it, before anyone thought to name quiet as something separate from life. Silence was not a condition imposed from outside. It was what remained when listening loosened its grip. Even memory softened here. Earlier conversations no longer echoed. Plans did not project themselves forward. The shapes of the day dissolved gently, like outlines erased without erasing the page beneath them. Time continued, but it did not advance. It widened. Moments spread into one another until distinction lost importance. One house, then another. One breath, then another. All equally present, all equally unremarkable. There was no watcher to confirm this stillness, no witness to hold it in place, and because no one was listening, nothing needed to be said. The village rested, not in silence, but in the absence of demand. Nothing asked to be heard. Nothing asked to be noticed. Sound existed, awareness thinned, and between the two, a quiet balance held steady, effortless and complete. The hours passed, but they did not leave footprints. They did not line themselves up. They did not announce their arrival or departure. Time moved the way fog moves, present everywhere, yet impossible to measure. Somewhere in the village, a light that had been left on finally dimmed, not because anyone noticed, but because the night deepened enough to receive it. Elsewhere, a shadow shifted across a wall as clouds rearranged themselves overhead. Nothing counted these changes. Nothing recorded sequence. The usual markers of time had loosened their hold. No bells rang. No schedules pulled attention forward. Even the sense of waiting faded as if the future had gently stepped aside. In one house, sleep settled more deeply. In another, it hovered quietly, neither arriving nor leaving. Both were equal. Both belonged to the same unmeasured stretch of night. The village did not experience this as duration. It experienced it as continuity. Moments did not stack. They flowed into one another until the idea of an hour no longer made sense. There was no need to know how long anything lasted. Breath moved, stillness held, and between them, time softened until it felt less like a line and more like a wide-open field with no edges to cross. Memory no longer reached backward. Anticipation no longer leaned forward. The present did not hold a name long enough to be called now. It simply existed, Nothing was late, nothing was early. The village rested inside this unmarked passage, untouched by urgency, untouched by delay. Even the night itself seemed unconcerned with moving on. And as these hours continued without marking themselves, the village remained exactly where it was held. Not by clocks or awareness, but by the quiet permission to stay as it was. What remained did not stay because it was held. It stayed because nothing asked it to leave. The village existed without effort now, not supported by attention, not sustained by memory. It rested the way ground rests beneath fog, present, unquestioned, and complete. Walls stood, roofs held their shape, paths curved gently where they always had. Yet none of these things asserted themselves. They were no longer objects to be recognized. They were simply there as they had been before being named. Inside the houses, sleep moved freely. It did not deepen or lighten. It did not progress. It simply settled where it was allowed to settle. Breath continued not as a signal of life, but as part of the same quiet persistence that held everything else together. Nothing in the village needed to be remembered to remain real. A chair stayed where it was placed. A window stayed partly open. Not because someone would return to them, but because nothing required them to change. Even awareness no longer moved across the scene. It did not survey or confirm. It did not linger. It had loosened enough to let things be exactly as they were. This was not emptiness. It was fullness without grasping. Everything that remained did so lightly without ownership, without identity pressing down on form, without any need to justify its presence. The night did not hold the village together. The village did not depend on the night. Both existed within the same quiet allowance. And in that allowance, nothing fell away, because nothing was being held in the first place. What remained was not something separate. It was simply what had never needed to be carried. The quiet did not arrive with meaning. It did not explain itself. It did not ask to be understood. It simply settled the way dust settles when nothing disturbs the air. There was no question waiting for an answer. No thought reaching out to define what this quiet was or why it had come. Explanation felt unnecessary, as though language itself had stepped back to make room. The village rested within this quiet without noticing it. Houses did not register the absence of sound. Streets did not respond to the lack of movement. Everything remained exactly as it was, unbothered by the change. Quiet was not the opposite of noise. It was what remained when nothing asked to be heard. Inside rooms, sleep held its gentle rhythm. Not deepening, not lifting, simply present like a low tide that did not need to turn. Breath continued without instruction. Hearts kept their steady pace. Even the idea of stillness softened. There was no effort to remain calm, no attempt to preserve silence. Nothing needed guarding. This quiet did not separate one place from another. It spread evenly without boundary. One house, then the next. One breath, then another. All included, none emphasized. Memory did not reach back to describe it. Anticipation did not reach forward to break it. The quiet existed outside of sequence, outside of story. It did not belong to the night. The night did not contain it. Both rested within something more spacious, something that did not need to be named. And because this quiet required no explanation, it remained free of interpretation. It did not become an experience to have or a state to achieve. It simply remained. The village no longer felt contained. Its edges softened first, then dissolved completely, as though boundaries had quietly agreed to step aside. Streets did not end. Walls did not separate. One space blended into the next without needing transition. There was no center to return to, no perimeter to hold. The village was not spread out. It was simply everywhere it needed to be. Houses remained, but not as structures to move between. They felt more like gentle shapes within the same continuous stillness. One roof, then another, all held within the same quiet field. Inside and outside lost their distinction. A window did not open onto the night. The night did not surround the house. Both existed together without overlap or division. Breath moved within sleeping bodies, yet it did not belong to anyone. It rose and fell as part of the same motion that held the air, the ground, the distance between places. Nothing here needed to be located. Sound, when it appeared, did not travel from one point to another. It surfaced briefly, then returned to where it came from without leaving a trace. The village had no edges because nothing pushed outward and nothing held inward. There was no effort to contain, no need to define. Even the idea of village loosened. What remained was not a place but a condition, quiet, open, and unbound. A resting that did not depend on form. There was no sense of being within it. There was no sense of observing it. The village did not fade. It did not transform. It simply ceased to be separate, and in that seamless stillness where nothing began and nothing ended, rest continued, uninterrupted, unnoticed, and complete. And as the village lost its edges, what remained began to move, gently, not as a place but as a quiet flow, carrying everything without resistance. The river did not rush. It moved with a steadiness that required no encouragement, no correction. Water passed over stones the way breath passes through sleep naturally without needing to be guided. Nothing in the river tried to arrive anywhere. The current held its course not by force but by agreement. It followed the shape of the land because the land was there. It curved, widened, narrowed, all without hesitation. Leaves rested on the surface, not floating ahead, not falling behind. They were carried exactly as they were without being asked to move. The river did not separate what belonged from what did not. It carried everything equally. A branch touched the water briefly, then lifted away. Ripples formed, then softened back into the whole. The river did not remember the contact. It did not resist it. Depth existed without being measured. Near the surface, light moved gently. Below, the water remained dark and quiet. Both were part of the same motion, neither needing attention. There was no sense of direction here. Not forward, not backward. Only movement that did not imply progress. The river did not know it was flowing. It did not know it was carrying anything. And because of that, nothing felt heavy. Time did not travel with the water. It stayed behind on the banks unnoticed. What remained in the river was continuity, unbroken, uncounted, sufficient. Sound softened as it touched the surface. Even the idea of listening felt unnecessary. The river spoke without language and nothing needed to respond. As water moved on, it did not leave anything behind, and nothing followed it. The river carried everything without effort because effort had never been required. The water never held on to what passed through it. Not the leaves that touched its surface. Not the stones it brushed along its bed. Not even the light that shimmered briefly. then slipped away. Everything arrived, stayed for a moment, and moved on without being kept, without being released. The river did not decide this. It was simply how water moved. A fallen branch rested against the current for a time. The water shaped itself around the obstacle, never pushing, never yielding. When the branch finally shifted, the river continued as if nothing had interrupted it. No trace remained. The surface changed constantly, yet nothing beneath it accumulated. Ripples formed and dissolved without memory. Depth remained steady, unconcerned with what touched it. The river did not carry history. What had passed moments ago did not linger as residue. What approached did not arrive as expectation. The water met each moment exactly as it was then allowed it to be gone. There was no clinging here, no resistance. Even when the current slowed, nothing gathered. When it widened, nothing spread thin. The river remained complete in every movement, regardless of shape. Sound softened as it entered the flow, losing definition before it could echo. The water did not answer. It did not absorb meaning. It simply moved on. In this effortless passage, nothing became a burden. Weight did not increase with distance. The river carried because carrying required no strength. What moved within it was not supported. It was included. And because nothing was ever held, nothing needed to be let go. The river flowed freely, not by intention but by nature. It did not practice release. It did not understand attachment. It simply continued unchanged by what passed through it. Nothing in the river became heavier with distance. Water moved mile after mile, yet carried no record of how far it had gone. What passed through moments ago did not add to what flowed now. Each movement remained complete on its own. The river did not gather weight from experience. Stones rested along its bed, smoothed slowly over time, but the water itself never thickened. It did not grow tired from traveling. It did not strain under what it carried. Depth remained light. Even where the river widened and slowed, nothing settled into burden. The current softened without collapsing. Movement continued without effort, as if gravity itself had learned to rest. The surface reflected what hovered above it, clouds, branches, passing light, but reflections did not press downward. They touched briefly, then released themselves. Nothing sank from memory. The river did not distinguish between what mattered and what did not. It carried fallen leaves and drifting shadows with the same ease. Neither left a mark. Weight required holding, and the river never held. Sound entered the water and thinned until it vanished. Motion entered and became part of motion. There was no accumulation, only continuity. Even stillness did not settle. In the quiet stretches where the current slowed to a gentle glide, the river did not pause. It remained in motion without appearing to move light, without becoming empty. Time did not add layers here. Experience did not pile up. Each moment arrived unencumbered, left unencumbered, and the river remained exactly as it was. Nothing needed to be carried forward. Nothing needed to be set down. The river flowed freely because it did not remember its own movement. It did not count its distance. It did not measure its load. And because nothing accumulated, nothing was ever heavy. Movement in the river did not aim itself. It did not decide where to go next. It did not orient toward an outcome. Water followed the land only because the land was there. When the river turned, it did not consider alternatives. When it widened, it did not choose expansion. Direction was not selected. It emerged. There was no forward here, no backward, only motion without intention. The current curved gently around stones without resistance. It did not confront obstacles or avoid them. It moved because movement was already happening. Even where the river appeared still, there was no pause. Motion continued beneath the surface, quiet and uninterrupted, needing no sign to confirm it. Nothing pointed the way. The river did not anticipate what lay ahead. It did not remember where it had been. It moved without narrative, without map. Light slid across the surface and disappeared. Shadows shifted and loosened. These changes did not guide the flow. They were carried along with it. The water did not check its course. It did not correct itself, because there was nothing to correct. In this movement, without direction, effort found no place to settle. There was no sense of progress to maintain, no path to stay upon. The river did not wander. It did not arrive. It remained in motion without needing a destination. Sound softened into the flow, losing shape before it could be traced. Even the idea of listening faded into the same gentle movement. Here, motion did not require awareness. Awareness did not guide motion. Both existed together, loosely aligned without dependence. And because movement needed no direction, it never lost its way. The flow did not ask before it moved. It did not pause at the edge of change. It did not seek approval from the ground it crossed or the space it entered. Water passed where openings existed, not because it was allowed, but because nothing opposed it. When the land gave way, the river continued. When the land narrowed, the river adjusted without protest. Permission was never part of the movement. The flow did not announce itself. It did not explain why it moved this way rather than another. It simply followed what was already possible, slipping through the path that appeared. Even resistance softened when it met the current. Stones did not block the river. They shaped it briefly, then released it. The flow did not argue. It did not insist. It continued. Nothing in the river waited for certainty. Nothing demanded reassurance. The water did not hesitate at shadows or light. It did not slow to consider depth. It passed through each condition, as if conditions were not separate from the movement itself. Sound entered and dissolved. Motion entered and became motion. The flow did not belong to the river alone. It extended into everything it touched. Leaves, reflections, silence, all moved together without hierarchy. Here, nothing needed to be cleared first. Nothing needed to be resolved. The flow did not prepare for what came next. It met each moment exactly as it arrived, then allowed it to pass without record. There was no sense of crossing a boundary, no threshold to mark transition. Movement remained continuous, unbroken by thought or expectation, and because the flow never asked permission, it never waited. It moved freely, not as an act of will, but as the simplest expression of what was already happening. At a certain depth, the river no longer appeared to move. The surface continued its gentle passage, but beneath it something steadier held everything in place. Motion and stillness were no longer separate states. They existed together without contrast. The river flowed and it rested. Neither interrupted the other. Stillness did not stop the water. Movement did not disturb the stillness. Both belonged to the same quiet continuity where nothing needed to change in order to continue. Here, the current did not hurry. Here, it did not pause. It remained present without needing to be seen as active or calm. The idea of choosing between the two dissolved as though the distinction had never been necessary. Light drifted across the surface and vanished. Below the water held no reflection. It carried depth without darkness, clarity without form. Sound reached this place and softened immediately, losing shape before it could echo. Even silence felt unnecessary to name. The river did not experience itself as flowing. It did not experience itself as still. It simply existed. Awareness, if it lingered at all, felt the same way. It did not follow movement. It did not settle into rest. It loosened its grip on both, allowing experience to continue without framing. Time did not pass here. It did not remain either. It blended into the same unmarked presence that held water motion and quiet together. Nothing needed to be carried forward. Nothing needed to be set down. And in this place where flow and stillness were the same, the last impulse to distinguish softened completely, leaving only a steady ease that did not move and did not stop. And as flow and stillness became indistinguishable, something quieter remained, like a gentle light present even when thinking no longer moved. When thinking loosened its hold, nothing went dark. What remained was not brightness and not absence. It was a soft clarity present without shining, steady without drawing attention to itself. This light did not illuminate objects. It did not reveal details. It simply remained the way warmth remains after a fire has settled, no longer flickering, no longer consuming anything. There was no thought announcing its presence, no idea forming around it. Thinking had stepped aside quietly, without being pushed away, without leaving a gap. And in that quiet space, the light continued, not as something to notice, but as something that did not need noticing. It did not belong to the eyes. It did not belong to the mind. It was not inside and not outside. The body rested within it without reacting. Breath moved somewhere beneath it, steady and unobserved. Sensation existed without contrast, without pulling attention in any direction. The light did not guide awareness. Awareness did not rest on the light. Both existed together without relationship. Time softened further here. Moments did not arrive or leave. They did not ask to be recognized. The light did not mark their passing. It did not change as anything changed. Even the sense of being aware grew thin. There was no observer standing apart from what was present. No one left to say this is happening. The light remained anyway, unaffected by whether it was known. This was not clarity of understanding. It was clarity without understanding. Nothing needed to be resolved. Nothing needed to be remembered. The light did not replace thought. It did not follow it. It simply remained when thinking stopped, quiet and sufficient, holding everything without effort and asking nothing in return. Clarity remained, but it did not point anywhere. It did not organize experience or suggest a path forward. It did not gather impressions or arrange them into meaning. It simply existed, open and uncentered, without asking to be used. There was no direction implied here. No orientation toward inside or outside. No movement toward understanding. The clarity was not sharp. It did not cut through confusion. It did not resolve anything. It softened edges without removing them, leaving experience intact but unmarked. Awareness did not aim itself within this clarity. It did not search for anchors. What was present did not need to be identified. Sensation existed without emphasis. Sound, if it appeared, did not travel. It rested briefly, then dissolved back into the same open field. The body remained settled, supported without comment. Breath moved somewhere beneath notice, steady and sufficient. Nothing asked to be adjusted. Clarity did not brighten as attention approached. It did not dim when attention drifted. It was not dependent. Time had little relevance here. Moments did not arrange themselves into sequence. They appeared complete, then released themselves without residue. The clarity did not register their passing. There was no sense of progress, no sense of return. Even the idea of being clear felt unnecessary. The clarity did not need to be recognized to remain. It did not require acknowledgement to continue. This was not insight. It was not awareness sharpening. It was the ease that remains when nothing needs to be aimed, followed, or understood. Clarity without direction did not lead anywhere else. It simply stayed quiet and sufficient, allowing everything to rest exactly where it was, without movement and without stillness needing to be chosen. There came a point when nothing needed to be known. Not because understanding had been reached and not because answers were found. Knowing simply lost its relevance the way a question fades when it no longer feels necessary. Nothing was missing. Experience did not ask to be explained. Sensations arose without requiring labels. Sound appeared without needing interpretation. Even silence did not invite meaning. The mind did not resist this. It did not attempt to gather information or fill the space. It rested relieved of its usual task, as though it had been carrying something for a long time, without realizing it could be set down. Here, there was no curiosity pulling forward, no memory reaching back. What was present felt complete without context. It did not depend on comparison. It did not ask to be placed within a story. The body remained settled, supported quietly. Breath moved without being tracked. The sense of being someone experiencing something softened, losing its edges. Awareness did not shrink. It widened, gently becoming less specific, less concerned with form. It did not need to know what it was aware of. It was enough that something was present without defining it. Time lost its usefulness. Moments did not arrive to be understood. They did not depart to be remembered. They hovered briefly, then dissolved into the same open clarity that held them. Nothing here needed explanation. Not rest, not clarity, not even the absence of thought. Knowing had stepped aside and nothing had taken its place. This was not confusion. It was ease without information. And in that ease, the last quiet effort to understand dissolved, leaving experience free to continue without being named, without being held, and without being known at all. Understanding did not disappear. It simply stopped forming. There was no moment where it broke apart or fell away. It loosened quietly, like a habit that no longer found a reason to continue. Experience remained, but the impulse to shape it into meaning softened until it was no longer present. Nothing asked to be grasped. Events did not assemble themselves into explanations. Sensations arose without suggesting conclusions. Even the familiar urge to connect one moment to the next faded, leaving each one free to exist on its own. The mind did not resist this change. It did not try to rebuild understanding. It rested, relieved of the need to make sense of what was already complete. Clarity remained, but it did not organize. It did not outline relationships or point toward insight. It allowed everything to appear exactly as it was without arranging it into something else. The body stayed settled, supported without question. Breath moved in the background, steady and unremarkable. There was no sense of being aware of the body, only a quiet inclusion where separation no longer mattered. Time lost another layer of structure. Moments did not follow one another. They appeared whole, then released themselves without sequence. Understanding had nothing to attach itself to. There was no confusion here. There was no insight either. Both required structure, and structure had loosened. Awareness did not sharpen. It did not fade. It remained open, even, and uninterested in forming conclusions. Understanding no longer formed because nothing required it. Experience did not ask to be translated. It did not ask to be known. And in this absence of forming rest, deepened not by moving forward but by settling fully into what was already present, complete and undisturbed. What remained did not carry meaning. It did not need to. Meaning had been a way of holding things together, and now nothing required holding. Experience continued without being interpreted. Sensation arose without pointing toward significance. Sound appeared without asking to be understood. Even the quiet itself did not suggest depth or importance. It simply was. The absence of meaning did not feel empty. It felt sufficient. Nothing here asked why. Nothing waited for because. The mind did not reach for explanation. It did not miss it. The habit of assigning meaning had softened so completely that it no longer felt absent. It felt unnecessary. Clarity remained, but it was not about anything. It did not illuminate purpose. It did not reveal insight. It rested evenly across everything that appeared without preference. The body stayed settled, supported quietly. Breath moved without rhythm being noticed. There was no sense of doing, no sense of allowing. Both had lost relevance. Time did not frame this state. Moments did not carry messages forward. They arrived complete, then dissolved without residue. Nothing was learned from them. Nothing needed to be. This was not confusion. It was not insight. It was experience, free from translation. What remained without meaning did not ask to be named. It did not ask to be remembered. It did not ask to continue or to end. It rested, and in resting without meaning, the lost, subtle effort to understand dissolved, leaving only a quiet openness where nothing needed to be known and nothing needed to be made of what was already present. The light remained, but it did not point anywhere. It offered no direction. It did not highlight a path or suggest a next step. It did not gather attention or invite focus. It was present without instruction. This light did not move across surfaces or settle on forms. It did not separate one thing from another. It did not ask the eyes to open or the mind to follow. It simply stayed. Awareness did not rest on it. Awareness did not turn away. Both existed together without relationship, without exchange. There was no sense of being illuminated, and no feeling of seeing more clearly. The light did not sharpen perception or soften it. It did not change what was present. It did not need to. The body remained settled, supported quietly. Breath moved without rhythm being noticed. Sensation existed without drawing a center around itself. Time had no place here. Moments did not move toward anything. They did not arrive from anywhere else. They did not ask to be held long enough to be recognized. The light did not mark their passing. Nothing needed to be understood. Nothing needed to be remembered. The absence of direction felt natural, as though direction had always been an added layer that could now be set aside. Without it, experience felt lighter, not emptier. The light did not guide rest. It did not deepen sleep. It simply allowed everything to remain exactly as it was, without effort and without commentary. And because it did not point anywhere, nothing needed to follow. The light stayed quiet and sufficient until even the idea of light softened into the same open stillness that held everything else unmarked, undirected, and complete. And as the light remained without direction, experience softened into something quieter, still like a dream, forming without needing meaning. The dream did not begin. It formed gently without a threshold to cross, as though it had already been present, and simply became noticeable when nothing else insisted on staying awake. There was no story taking shape, no sequence to follow, no message waiting to be understood. Images appeared without context, then softened before they could settle. A color lingered briefly. A sensation passed through without attaching itself to form. Nothing asked to be remembered. The dream did not explain itself. It did not hint at meaning or point toward interpretation. It moved the way mist moves, gathering, thinning, rearranging, without direction and without purpose. Awareness did not watch this happen. It did not step forward to observe. It rested nearby, diffuse and uncentered, allowing the dream to continue without supervision. The body remained settled, supported quietly. Breath moved somewhere beneath the dream, steady and unremarkable. Sensation blended into the same softness that held everything else. Time had little influence here. Moments did not connect. They hovered briefly, then dissolved, replaced by nothing in particular. The dream did not progress. It did not arrive anywhere. Even the idea of dreaming felt unnecessary. There was no effort to stay within it, no effort to wake from it. The dream did not need attention to continue. It did not need to be believed or followed. It remained light enough to change at any moment, yet steady enough to feel complete. Meaning did not enter, and because meaning stayed away, nothing weighed the dream down. It moved freely, unburdened by interpretation, allowed to be exactly what it was: quiet, fluid, and sufficient. The dream continued, not as a message to decode, but as a gentle field where nothing needed to be known. Images appeared without deciding to be images. They did not arrive fully shaped. They did not hold still long enough to be recognized. A suggestion of color passed through, then thinned. A texture surfaced briefly, then softened back into the same quiet field. Nothing asked to be seen. Edges never formed clearly. Shapes hinted at themselves, then dissolved before becoming distinct. There was no foreground or background, no place for attention to settle. The dream did not assemble scenes. It allowed impressions to pass through one another, overlapping gently without creating structure. What appeared did not replace what came before. It simply drifted alongside it, unweighted and transient. Awareness did not follow these images. It did not attempt to hold them in view. It remained diffuse, present without focusing, letting each impression come and go without interruption. There was no sense of distance here. Images did not feel near or far. They did not occupy space in a way that required orientation. They existed lightly, without position. Time did not organize them. Moments did not line up. Nothing progressed from one image to the next. The dream did not move forward. It rearranged itself softly, like light shifting behind closed eyes. Meaning stayed absent. No image hinted at symbolism. No form suggested interpretation. They appeared free of association. allowed to be exactly as they were for as long as they remained. The body rested beneath this, drifting unchanged. Breath continued somewhere in the background, steady and unnoticed. Sensation blended into the same gentle openness. Images thinned further as they drifted. Eventually, even the sense of imagery softened. What remained was not blankness, but a quiet continuity where nothing needed to appear clearly in order to be present. The dream continued unformed and sufficient, carrying impressions without shape and without weight. Scenes never fully came together. They hinted at themselves, then softened before structure could form. A sense of place almost appeared, then drifted away. Nothing stayed long enough to become a setting. There was no beginning to step into, no middle to remain within, no ending to move toward. The dream did not arrange moments into order. It allowed fragments to float near one another without asking them to connect. What might have been a scene remained a suggestion, light and incomplete. Awareness did not attempt to organize this. It did not look for continuity or coherence. It rested nearby, allowing impressions to pass without asking where they belonged. Space felt open and undefined. Near and far lost their meaning. What appeared did not occupy a position that could be measured. It existed without location, without depth needing to be perceived. Time did not guide the dream. Moments did not follow one another. They overlapped gently, then released. Nothing progressed. Nothing returned. The idea of sequence never took hold. Meaning stayed absent. No scene carried implication. No arrangement suggested purpose. The dream remained free of narrative weight, untouched by explanation. The body rested beneath this softness, unchanged and steady. Breath continued, quietly, unnoticed. Sensation remained diffuse without calling attention. As scenes continued not to assemble, the need for them faded as well. Nothing required coherence to continue. The dream did not rely on structure to remain present. Eventually, even the suggestion of scenes thinned. What remained was not emptiness, but a gentle openness where impressions could arise or not arise without difference. The dream continued, unassembled and sufficient, holding nothing together and asking nothing to fall apart. Memory did not gather here. What appeared did not leave a trace strong enough to be carried forward. Impressions arose, hovered briefly, then dissolved, before they could settle into anything that might be remembered. Nothing asked to be kept. The dream did not mark moments as important or insignificant. It did not pause to store details. What passed through it remained light, unweighted by repetition or recognition. There was no sense of recalling. Images that had drifted moments ago did not return as echoes. Scenes that never assembled did not linger as fragments. Each impression existed only for the time it was present, then released itself completely. Awareness did not reach back. It did not attempt to retrieve what had already passed. It rested in the same open field, unconcerned with continuity, uninterested in holding on to anything that might define a before or after. The body remained settled beneath this forgetting. Breath continued quietly steady and unobserved. Sensation did not organize itself into landmarks. Nothing signaled that something should be remembered. Time did not accumulate. Moments did not stack into experience. They appeared singular, complete, and then gone, leaving no residue to connect them. The dream did not progress because there was nothing to build upon. Meaning remained absent. Without meaning, memory found no anchor. Without anchors, nothing stayed long enough to become familiar. This, forgetting, did not feel like loss. It felt like lightness. There was no effort involved in letting go because nothing had been taken hold of. The dream moved freely, unburdened by recall, unmarked by repetition. As memory continued not to form, even the idea of forgetting softened. What remained was not blankness, but a quiet continuity where nothing needed to be remembered in order for rest to continue. The dream flowed on untouched by memory, complete in each moment and finished without needing to end. The dream did not circle back on itself. It did not return to familiar shapes or revisit earlier impressions. What passed through it moved on completely without echo or variation. There was no pattern forming, no refrain to recognize. Nothing repeated. A softness appeared, then thinned. A suggestion of motion lingered briefly, then dissolved into the same open quiet. Each moment stood on its own, unrelated to what had come before. There was no sense of again. The dream did not rehearse. It did not loop or refine itself. It did not try different versions of the same image. Everything appeared, once then was released without comparison. Awareness did not notice the absence of repetition. It did not look for continuity or familiarity. It remained diffuse and uncentered, allowing the dream to move freely, without checking where it had been. The body rested beneath this movement, unchanged. Breath continued quietly, steady and unobserved. Sensation remained, even without rising or falling into focus. Time did not offer structure here. Without repetition, moments could not accumulate into duration. They arrived complete, then passed without leaving impressions behind. The dream did not progress because there was nothing to build upon. Meaning stayed absent. Without meaning, nothing asked to be reinforced. Without reinforcement, nothing returned. The dream remained light, unburdened by expectation. This lack of repetition did not feel unfinished. It felt open. Nothing needed to come back to be complete. Nothing needed to happen again to be confirmed. The dream moved forward only in the sense that it did not stay. It flowed quietly, never retracing its steps, never forming a path. And because it did not repeat, there was nothing to hold on to, nothing to anticipate and nothing to wake for. The dream continued, unique in every moment, resting in its own quiet movement and complete, without ever returning. Sleep did not need a story to continue. There was no thread to follow, no image to return to, no scene waiting to resolve itself. What had been dream softened further, loosening its last traces of form, until even drifting impressions felt unnecessary. Nothing replaced them. Sleep remained, not as an event unfolding, but as a steady condition that did not require content. It did not depend on images or memory. It did not rely on movement or stillness. It simply continued. The body rested fully within this continuity. Breath moved without being noticed. Muscles remained released, unprepared for anything. Sensation existed without asking to be identified. Awareness had no role to play here. It did not watch sleep deepen. It did not follow experience. It thinned into the same quiet field, no longer separate enough to observe what was happening. Time did not advance. Moments did not pass one another. There was no sense of before or after, no sequence to mark. Sleep did not progress toward a deeper state. It was already sufficient where it was. Even the idea of sleeping softened. There was no awareness of being asleep, no sense of falling or remaining. Sleep continued without reference, Nothing needed to be remembered. Nothing needed to be let go. The absence of story did not feel empty. It felt complete, as though nothing else was required to hold rest in place. And because sleep did not rely on narrative, it did not shift when narrative dissolved. It remained steady, uninterrupted and quiet. Here, nothing happened, and because nothing happened, nothing needed to change. Sleep continued without story, without meaning, and without effort, resting in itself and allowing everything else to rest with it. And without noticing, when it began, rest was already there, settled gently before attention ever arrived. Sleep did not announce itself. There was no clear moment when it arrived, no signal that marked its beginning. It was already present, settled quietly in the background, long before attention thought to look for it. The body had been resting for some time without being aware of it. Breathing moved in a steady, unmeasured rhythm. The chest rose and fell without effort, without intention, without anyone noticing the movement at all. Muscles were no longer holding anything, not because they had been told to release, but because there was nothing left to hold. The familiar tension that once outlined the shape of the body had softened not into heaviness but into something neutral and unremarkable. Sleep did not deepen. It did not move forward or downward. It simply remained already sufficient, already complete. There was no transition to follow, no stage to pass through. Thoughts had not stopped suddenly. They had faded in the way distant sounds fade at night, still present somewhere but too far away to matter. No single thought asked to be completed. No image insisted on clarity. Awareness did not watch this happen. It arrived late, briefly, like a visitor stepping into a room where everything had already settled. And even that awareness did not stay long. There was nothing for it to do. Nothing required observation. Nothing needed recognition. Sleep did not belong to anyone. There was no sense of falling asleep, because sleep had not been reached. It had simply been there first, waiting without patience, without expectation. Time did not pass in a way that could be tracked. Moments did not line up. The mind no longer marked sequence or duration. Whatever had come before was no longer relevant, and whatever might come after did not yet exist. Sleep arrived before being noticed, and because it was not noticed, it remained undisturbed, quiet, steady, and complete, holding the body and mind in a rest that required nothing in return. Rest did not wait to be confirmed. It did not ask whether the body had truly settled or whether the mind had fully let go. It arrived without checking conditions, without verifying readiness, without requiring agreement. The body responded naturally. Breath found its own pace, slower than before, yet not intentionally slowed. The spaces between each inhale and exhale widened gently, like pauses that did not need to be measured. The body no longer adjusted itself. It stayed as it was comfortable enough to be forgotten. There was no effort to remain still. Stillness happened on its own, not as a posture, but as the absence of movement needing to occur. Even small sensations, warmth, pressure, contact, lost their importance. They existed, but they no longer asked for interpretation. The mind did not resist. It did not try to stay awake, and it did not try to fall asleep. It hovered briefly between those ideas, then released them both. Thoughts no longer formed complete sentences. They softened into fragments, then into quiet impressions, then into nothing that required language at all. Rest did not deepen through intention. It became complete by not being interfered with. There was no sense of progress, no inner voice tracking how relaxed the body had become or how distant the mind felt. Those measurements had already dissolved. Even the idea of resting faded. What remained was simple continuity, unbroken, neutral, and calm. The kind of calm that does not feel peaceful, because it does not contrast itself with disturbance. Awareness thinned again, not disappearing but loosening its edges until it blended with the same stillness it might have tried to notice. There was no observer standing apart from rest. There was only rest itself existing without explanation. Nothing needed reassurance. Nothing needed to be named. Rest required no confirmation to continue, and because it was not checked, it remained steady, quietly holding everything exactly as it was. The sense of someone resting became less defined. There had once been a quiet awareness of a body at ease, a mind settling, a presence allowing rest to happen. Now even that softened. The idea of who was resting no longer felt necessary. The body continued exactly as it was. Breathing moved without reference. Weight remained supported without being checked. There was no impulse to adjust, no urge to improve comfort, no need to confirm position. Everything remained sufficient without supervision. What changed was not the state itself, but the relationship to it. The mind no longer formed a center around which experience gathered. There was no inner place from which rest was being observed. Sensations appeared and faded without belonging to anyone. A sound might arise distant and indistinct. A sensation might pass through mild and neutral. Neither required response. Thoughts, if they appeared at all, did not arrive as thoughts. They were more like traces, faint impressions without structure, too incomplete to follow. They dissolved before becoming recognizable. Rest did not feel owned. It did not feel personal. It did not feel achieved. It was simply present, the way darkness is present when light has faded without effort or intention. Even the subtle idea of letting go no longer applied. There was nothing left to release because there was no one holding anything. The gentle boundary between observer and experience thinned until it no longer felt meaningful. Awareness did not disappear. It became indistinguishable from what was happening. There was no distance between rest and knowing rest. No gap between experience and the space in which it appeared. Everything existed in the same quiet field, unmarked and uninterrupted. Nothing needed to settle further. Nothing needed to change. The one who had been resting faded naturally, and what remained continued on steady, neutral, and complete, without needing a center to hold it together. Rest no longer needed to be called rest. The word itself had grown unnecessary, too defined for what remained. What continued was quieter than language, simpler than any label meant to describe it. There was no contrast now, no sense of tension giving way to ease, no feeling of effort dissolving into comfort. Those comparisons belonged to earlier moments when something had still been tracked or measured. Here, nothing was being compared. The body remained supported, but not felt as a body. Weight existed without edges. Warmth existed without location. Even the boundary between inside and outside softened, becoming less relevant with each passing moment. Breath continued, but not as a rhythm to follow. It was simply happening, neither slow nor fast, neither deep nor shallow. There was no interest in it, and so it did not stand out. It blended into the same quiet field as everything else. Awareness did not turn inward or outward. There was no direction for it to take. Nothing stood apart to be noticed. Experience did not gather into a center, and it did not spread outward either. It rested exactly where it was without orientation. Even absence felt full. Not full of content, but full in the sense that nothing was missing. Nothing waited to arrive. Nothing needed to leave for this to continue. Time no longer suggested movement. It did not feel as though something had been happening for a while, nor did it feel as though it had just begun. Duration lost its meaning when nothing was changing. There was no effort to remain here. And because there was no effort, there was no chance of drifting away. What remained was steady without being held quiet, without being protected. Rest no longer needed a name, because there was nothing else for it to be mistaken for. It continued as it was unmarked, uninterrupted, and complete, without asking anything of the mind at all. What remained no longer felt like a state. There had once been something that could be described, a condition of rest, a depth of sleep, a quiet continuity. Now even that softened. There was no clear quality to point to, no texture to describe, no experience standing apart enough to be named. Nothing was missing. Nothing was present in a way that required recognition. The body continued as it had, but without distinction. There was no sense of heaviness or lightness, no awareness of posture or support. Sensation did not gather into signals. It spread evenly, then thinned, then became irrelevant. Breath still happened, but it did not appear as movement. It did not create rhythm or pause. It left no trace that could be followed. It was simply part of the same undivided field as everything else. Awareness no longer hovered. There was no subtle watcher remaining, no quiet witness observing from a distance. Whatever had once known experience had blended completely into what was happening, leaving no separation behind. Even stillness was no longer noticeable. Not because there was movement, but because stillness itself had lost contrast. Without change to compare against it, no longer stood out. Time did not stretch or compress. It simply ceased to matter. There was no duration to inhabit, no moment to remain within. Sequence dissolved when nothing was unfolding. There was no effort to stay here, and because there was no effort, there was no risk of leaving. What continued did so without support, without intention, without maintenance. No state was being held. No depth was being reached. There was only this unmarked neutral and complete continuing quietly, without needing to be known as anything at all. There was no moment to remember. Sleep did not arrive in a way that could be pointed to. It did not cross a threshold or replace one state with another. It had already been present long enough that noticing it would have meant leaving it. Nothing noticed. The body did not signal completion. There was no final release, no deeper settling, no sensation marking an end. Support remained without being felt. Breath continued without being tracked. Everything that could have been experienced blended into the same quiet continuity. Even absence felt unremarkable. Not empty, not full, simply sufficient. Awareness did not fade away. It no longer needed to. There was nothing for it to attend to, and so it rested without function, indistinguishable from what remained. No thoughts formed, no images lingered, and because nothing asked to be followed, nothing was interrupted. Time did not move forward. It did not pause either. The idea of time had loosened so completely that it no longer applied. There was no sense of duration, no sense of having been here for a while, no expectation of what might come next. Sleep did not deepen. It did not need to. There was nothing beneath it to fall into and nothing above it to return to. What remained was steady without effort, quiet without intention, and complete without definition. Nothing was held, nothing was released. Sleep arrived and nothing noticed because noticing was no longer necessary. And in that absence of notice, rest continued on its own, unmarked and uninterrupted, carrying everything gently forward without ever needing a story to do so. And as sleep remained without being noticed, the night itself continued quietly, without needing a story to carry it forward. The night did not begin. It was already there, spread evenly in every direction without edges or markers. There was no moment when it arrived and no signal announcing its presence. It simply continued as it had been doing all along. Nothing in the night asked to be understood. Darkness was not an absence. It was not a condition replacing light. It was a steady background in which nothing needed to stand out. Shapes did not form clearly, and because of that, nothing invited attention. The body remained held within this continuity, not held by effort or intention, but by the simple fact of being supported. There was no sense of position, no awareness of where the body began or ended. Sensation existed only faintly, too neutral to become meaningful. Breath moved quietly, not as something happening to the body, but as part of the same stillness as the night itself. There was no rhythm to follow, no pause to notice. It blended into the background and disappeared. The mind did not search for anything. There was no story unfolding, no memory replaying, no anticipation forming. Whatever once connected one moment to the next had loosened completely. Nothing needed sequence. Time no longer arranged itself into before and after. The night did not move forward. It did not progress toward morning. It rested exactly where it was without direction. Even the idea of night softened. There was no label for what remained. No concept standing apart enough to describe it. Experience did not gather into meaning. It did not dissolve either. It simply continued. Quiet, uninterrupted, and without narration, holding everything gently in a space where nothing needed to happen and nothing needed to end. Darkness did not wait to be seen. It did not depend on eyes being closed or open, on awareness being present or absent. It existed without reference, filling everything evenly, without center and without edge. Nothing observed it. There was no sense of someone resting within the night, no feeling of being surrounded by darkness. The distinction between what was inside and what was outside softened until it no longer mattered. The body remained where it was, but without location. Support was no longer noticed as support. Contact was no longer felt as contact. Sensation thinned into something so neutral that it could no longer gather into experience. Breath continued quietly, not as movement, not as rhythm. It was simply part of the same continuity, indistinguishable from the stillness around it. Awareness did not withdraw. It also did not remain. There was no place for it to stand apart, no perspective from which darkness could be known. Whatever once noticed experience had dissolved into the same field as what was happening. Thought did not pause. It was already absent. There was no inner commentary fading out, no last fragment drifting away. Language had loosened earlier, and now even the sense of silence did not remain as something recognizable. Time did not hold its shape. It did not stretch or collapse. It did not pass. Without change, there was nothing for time to measure, and so it no longer appeared. The night did not deepen. It did not progress toward anything else. There was no movement toward sleep or waking, no direction forward or back. Darkness required no witness. And because nothing observed it, nothing disturbed it. What remained continued quietly, evenly, and without interruption, resting in itself without needing to be known at all. The night no longer felt like night. There had been darkness and a sense of continuity within it. Now even that softened. The idea of night as something present, something ongoing, loosened, until it no longer held its shape. Nothing replaced it. There was no light, but there was also no darkness to contrast against. The difference between the two no longer mattered. What remained was quieter than either, free of comparison. The body did not disappear. It simply stopped being distinct. There was no outline to sense, no position to recognize, no boundary separating form from space. Whatever had once been called the body blended completely into what surrounded it. Breath continued without movement, not slow, not still. It left no impression that could be followed. It was neither happening nor stopping. It belonged to the same undivided field as everything else. Awareness did not shift. It did not turn inward or dissolve outward. It no longer had direction. There was no point from which experience could be known, and no experience standing apart to be known. Nothing waited. There was no expectation of sleep or waking. No sense that this would lead somewhere else. The continuity that remained did not promise anything beyond itself. Time did not hold. It did not stretch, pass, or pause. Without change, there was no sequence to follow. Without sequence, duration lost meaning. Even stillness faded. Not into movement, but into something simpler. Something without contrast, without stillness, without motion. What remained could not be named. It was not night, it was not rest, it was not sleep. And because it was none of these, it required no effort to continue. It remained quietly, evenly, and without interruption, complete without needing to be known and present without needing to be called anything at all. Continuity no longer felt like something that was continuing. There had been a sense of things remaining, of something ongoing beneath the absence of story. Now even that thinned. The idea of continuing quietly dissolved, leaving nothing that needed to carry itself forward. Nothing stopped, nothing moved on. What remained did not require duration to exist. It did not unfold across moments. It did not persist from one instant to the next. It existed without leaning on time at all. The body was no longer implied, not absent but unnecessary. There was no suggestion of form resting within space, no sense of presence occupying a location. Whatever had once been, felt as physical, had blended completely into the same undifferentiated field. Breath left no trace. It did not come or go. It did not mark passage. It did not indicate life or rest. It was simply no longer a reference point. Awareness did not hover nearby. There was no edge from which it could observe, no background against which it could appear. The subtle sense of something knowing softened until it was no longer distinct from what was known. Even quiet was no longer noticeable. not because sound had returned, but because silence itself had lost contrast. Without difference, nothing stood out enough to be noticed. There was no holding, and because there was no holding, there was no need to let go. Nothing remained in order to remain. Nothing continued in order to continue. The idea of continuity itself was no longer relevant. What remained was not stable. It was not unstable. It simply was without condition, without reference, without effort, and because nothing depended on it, nothing disturbed it. The night continued without continuing, resting quietly beyond story, beyond time, and beyond the need to be anything at all. There was no sense of something remaining. The subtle feeling that something had been there quietly, present, gently, ongoing, softened, until it no longer held meaning. Remaining implied duration, and duration was no longer relevant. Nothing needed to stay. Nothing needed to leave. There was no background against which presence could be felt. No foreground where experience might appear. The distinction between what was and what was not had dissolved without effort. The body was not absent, it was simply not referenced. There was no suggestion of form, no hint of outline, no sense of occupying space. Physicality did not withdraw, it became unnecessary. Breath was not noticed, not because it had stopped and not because it was hidden. It no longer served as a sign of anything. Without sequence, without contrast, it did not register. Awareness did not fade. It also did not remain. There was no knowing standing apart from what was happening, and no happening distinct enough to be known. The idea of awareness gently loosened and fell away without resistance. Even emptiness did not stand out. There was no sense of space holding things, no openness waiting to be filled. Emptiness implies the absence of something, and nothing had been missing. There was no effort here, and because there was no effort, there was no release. Letting go had already completed itself earlier without being noticed. Nothing was held in place, nothing drifted. What remained was not presence, it was not absence. It was beyond the need to be either. The night did not continue. It did not end. It simply did not require anything further, resting quietly, beyond remaining, beyond awareness, beyond story, without needing to be known at all. Nothing followed the night. There was no final moment, no closing scene, no sense of completion arriving. What had been present did not conclude. It simply did not require continuation anymore. There was no awareness waiting for something else to happen. No background silence holding experience. No foreground sensation asking to be noticed. Even the idea of this had softened beyond recognition. The body did not register. Not because it was absent and not because it had disappeared, but because it no longer served as a reference. There was no inside or outside, no boundary separating form from space. Breath did not mark anything. It did not indicate rest. It did not indicate life. Without sequence, without contrast, it could not be used to point to experience. Awareness did not dissolve. It also did not remain. There was no knowing and no not knowing. No presence standing apart from absence. The distinction itself had quietly loosened and fallen away. Nothing needed to be held together. There was no continuity to protect, no stillness, to maintain no depth, to remain within. All of these ideas belonged to earlier moments when something had still been named. Now nothing required a name. Time did not end, it simply ceased to apply. There was no sense of being here and no sense of leaving. No arrival, no departure, no transition between one state and another. The night continued without story, without witness, without duration. And because nothing followed it, nothing was interrupted. What remained, if it could be called remaining at all, rested quietly beyond effort, beyond awareness, beyond the need to be anything. And in that quiet, nothing needed to happen. Thank you for resting here tonight. If you've drifted into sleep, there's nothing more you need to do. And if you're still listening, simply allow the night to carry you the rest of the way. This is the long night. Sleep well. Rods.